Good afternoon, good morning, good evening for all of you joining, distinguished speakers, participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this workshop as part of the 2021 Southeast Asia Development Symposium. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. My name is Toru Kubo. I'm the director of the Southeast Asia Energy Division of the Asian Development Bank. These are very challenging times, and we hope that you're all safe and well. We're looking forward to the time when we can see you in person, hopefully next year, for the 2022 symposium. But in the meantime, I feel very lucky that we can stay connected like this remotely, thanks in part to electricity. At this year's symposium, decision makers, thought leaders, and change makers have shared their insights on how to better collaborate and innovate to accelerate the region's recovery from the pandemic. I would really like to congratulate all the energy sector stakeholders, many of whom are joining today, for the wonderful job you have been doing so far to keep the energy systems running, to keep the lights on, enabling information flow, essential health services running, allowing work and education to continue remotely, and supporting businesses. And very soon, we will have to focus on delivering vaccination to the cities and remote corners of the country, which is not possible without reliable electricity that would support a robust cold storage chain. So the hard and important work of this group and the energy community continues. This workshop is an important part of this discussion on a green recovery in Southeast Asia to drive sustainable growth now and into the future. There are two sessions. The first one is a power sector transition from fossils to renewables. And the second session is on ADB's energy policy consultation. These sessions go hand in hand as we at ADB strive to help accelerate this transition to affordable and low carbon energy systems in a just and fair manner that is inclusive. This is a very exciting and dynamic time. As energy professionals, we're lucky. We talk about paradigm shifts, but that is exactly what we're witnessing and being a part of. Renewables have already become cost competitive with thermal power in many of our countries. Over just the past 2 years, we've seen an incredible acceleration in solar deployment in Vietnam, with over 9 gigawatts of rooftop solar coming online. In Thailand, we're starting to see peer-to-peer power trading between solar energy systems and consumers. Now in Cambodia, we saw the lowest rates in Southeast Asia for grid-connected solar, 3.78 cents per kilowatt hour, which ADB supported through a combination of public and private sector funding and PPP transaction advisory. Now, I think all of you know that we've seen even lower rates in Latin America, in some parts of Europe, and especially the Middle East, below 2 cents per kilowatt hour. But when we talk to our Southeast Asian friends, they've always said, well, those are totally different conditions with much higher irradiation rates, less cloud cover, and land availability. So please don't talk about them. But with the Cambodian deal, there's no more excuse because the conditions are similar. And we've received so much interest from the Southeast Asian ASEAN neighbors. And according to various analyses, this is very important, new renewable energy will likely become more competitive than continuing to run existing coal plants within the next decade. So around in the next 10 years, it would be much more cost effective to build a new renewable energy plant than the coal plants that are running now. So it certainly doesn't make sense to invest in new coal plants with an estimated 30, 40 years life now that would become a financial burden to governments and or consumers after only 10 plus years. And we would like to congratulate the government of the Philippines for declaring a moratorium on new coal power plants, becoming the first Southeast Asian nation to do so. Now, speaking about the Philippines, the government of the Philippines also passed an energy efficiency law 2 years ago. It's very exciting, and many development partners are eager to support its implementation. Thailand, who has long been a leader in energy efficiency, especially in the industrial sector, is exploring ways to advance energy efficiency in commercial and residential sectors. We often say energy efficiency is the first fuel that is the most cost effective, and it really must go hand in hand with supply side investment to ensure resource optimization. Now, talking about recovery from the pandemic, an issue that is very high on the minds of policymakers is jobs, J-O-B-S, jobs. Energy projects can provide job opportunities directly during the recovery phase, providing livelihoods during the implementation of projects, and the ongoing operation and maintenance of energy systems. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, job creation per dollar invested in the renewable energy sector creates almost 3 times as many jobs as those in the fossil fuel industry. There are also opportunities to support gender equality. In 2019, women represented 32% of full-time employees in the renewable energy sector, 32%, compared to 22% in the conventional oil and gas businesses. We're very fortunate to have an excellent speaker from IRENA today, and we can talk more about these substantial benefits. Now, that is about creating jobs and contributing to gender equality. Then there's a pressing issue about protecting jobs in the manufacturing and trade sectors. The Carbon Border Adjustment, or CBA mechanism, many of you may have heard, this has been talked about for many years, is really picking up steam. This is the idea that trade has to be fair and to adjust for the cost of companies to reduce their carbon footprints for production within a bubble, let's say Europe, and for those products produced outside the bubble with weaker carbon regulation, there needs to be a border tax imposed to adjust and make a level playing field. The European Parliament just passed a resolution on the CBA mechanism 2 days ago, and it was also a part of President Biden's climate plan. Our Southeast Asian countries have large manufacturing bases, and companies will need to be able to source affordable clean energy to remain competitive. So we have opportunities with the rapidly declining costs of clean energy solutions, low-hanging fruit on demand-side energy efficiency, and the real need to shift to create and protect jobs. There's a lot of work to do, and today is an important opportunity to absorb from and discuss with the brightest minds during the first session, and have our collective views heard and reflected through the second session on ADB Energy Policy Consultation. Thank you again for joining, and really looking forward to a lively discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tor. That was a great way to introduce this session as we get into some of these topics in more detail. So as Tor mentioned, we have a speaker joining us from IRENA. We have a speaker who can talk to us about the coal sector and its current situation and how we can support that shift from coal to renewables. And then we have 2 speakers, one from Indonesia and one from the Philippines, who can talk to the country specific situations. And I think that's an important way to attack this problem as we look for solutions, as we seek interest and expertise from around the world. Take those people who have understanding of the global situation, and also people who have understanding of the specific country situation. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the presenters that we have today. Our first speaker is Mr. Michael Renner, who's an officer in the Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center of IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency based in Abu Dhabi. So his work at IRENA is focused on the socio-economic impacts of renewable energy, including employment and just transition issues. And he's a co-author of IRENA's Renewable Energy and Jobs Annual Review. And he's going to speak to some of these topics today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael. I look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, David, and I'm really glad to be with you here today. At IRENA, we argue quite strongly that the energy transition must go hand in hand with efforts to recover from the pandemic in the shorter run, of course, but while ensuring that we actually meet climate and development goals as we navigate the current crisis and as we look forward to the next several decades. So let me move actually I seem not to be able to move my slide. Okay, I'm sorry about this. I think there was a temporary lapse and I hit it twice now. Okay, so we have examined job creation in renewable energy worldwide in our report series that you just mentioned, David, Renewable Energy and Jobs Annual Review. And this slide shows those reports that we have done in the top of the slide, along with some of the other work that we are doing on socioeconomics of renewable energy and of the energy transition. So you can see that, for example, we are looking at other issues like what we call leveraging local capacities. And this series of reports examines opportunities for countries to create domestic value, looking at both the material requirements and then the labor inputs for, we have done so far a report on solar PV, we have looked at onshore wind, we have looked at offshore wind, and we now are actually preparing 2 to 3 more reports on other technologies in that same line. But we have also, and Toro had mentioned that kindly at the beginning in his introduction, we have done a fair bit of work on the gender aspect of renewable energy. So we have looked across the renewable energy sector. We have assessed the share of women in the workforce there, which looks good in comparison to oil and gas. Does actually not look so good in all of the renewable energy technologies. We have done a report on wind, for example, where the share is much lower than would seem to be the case in, for example, in solar PV. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think we just hope to create more awareness of what the reality is and what the opportunities are. So finally, in this slide, I want to just point to what I show on the bottom is we also have a series of reports that really are based on economic modeling of IRENA's energy transition scenarios to 2030 and to 2050. And in that context, we analyze what the transition means in terms of GDP development, in terms of human welfare benefits, and of course, in terms of employment. So with that, let me move to my next slide. And for some reason, I apologize. Yeah, okay. It seems I'm having a little trouble with moving this slide, so bear with me, please, as I try to do that. So this slide really sort of summarizes some of the findings from our recent reports in this series. We estimate that in the most recent year that we have looked at, 2019, at least 11.5 million people worldwide held jobs in renewable energy directly and in the supply chains. You can see that the number has grown from about 7.3 million in 2012. So there is some real good news there. There is some real dynamism in this field, and particularly in solar PV. I just want to point out that we show separately on the top hydropower because there we have a different methodology. And that methodology really only allows us to confidently talk about direct jobs. So this is not a complete accounting in that particular sector. Moving on to the next slide. This sort of shows the most recent year that we have for 2019 in a slightly different way, really highlighting where we see the strongest share of employment, which is solar photovoltaics, but also liquid biofuels, hydropower, wind is quite prominent. And let me point out here, so as I just mentioned before, the share of women in the workforce is still something that I think needs a lot more recognition, a lot more awareness of where the opportunities and the challenges lie. And as I mentioned before, the report that we did on wind power shows that that sector really is not doing better than the traditional sector of oil and gas. So I think we have to really build the awareness and get some traction on policies to remedy and change that situation. Let me then just move on to my next slide. And so here I want to just highlight some of the major countries that we cover in our report. Not surprisingly, probably to any of you on this in this webinar, China is really figuring quite strongly with almost 4.4 million jobs. But then there are a number of other countries like the US, Brazil, the members of the EU, that really figure quite prominently. And this is really not very surprising, right? Because these countries, all in all, are the major installation markets still at this point. They are either very strong in terms of generating the equipment, such as solar panels or wind turbines, or they are really very strong engineering powers or factors in construction. So it's not surprising that they figure very prominently. But we do include in each of our annual reports a number of countries that we want to highlight in addition to these major ones, right? And so we have actually, and I've put this on the right-hand side of the slide, we have some information for countries in Southeast Asia, where we highlight particularly the issue with regard to solar PV and also the biofuel situation. And I think as Toru had mentioned at the beginning, Vietnam actually has really come into its own in this very, very quickly, and is quite a prominent factor now, along with countries like Malaysia, Philippines, to some extent Thailand as well. And I think we will probably see a lot more dynamism happening in these countries and some of the others in the region as well. I'm going to move on to some of the other work we're doing in terms of scenario building and then examining what do these scenarios mean in terms of employment generation until 2030 and until 2050. And so we have two scenarios. One that we call the planned energy scenario, which is basically a business as usual scenario. It reflects what governments have at present really committed to do or already planning to do. But then we also look at what we call the transforming energy scenario, which is a much more ambitious plan to really stay with what is needed in terms of fulfilling the promises under the Paris Climate Agreement. And you can basically see that under the transforming energy scenario, we project that the global energy sector as a whole will likely employ 100 million people by 2050, up from about 58 million now. So it's a very tremendous amount of growth. But I think more importantly, the composition of the employment and of the sector, of course, generally, is likely to shift quite tremendously in the direction of renewable energy and other energy transition related fields, such as energy efficiency, power grids, and energy flexibility. And so this slide really just gives you a brief summary of the employment findings that we have in this context. So renewable energy in particular, we figure will be quite prominent with about 42 million jobs in 2050. Now, let me highlight a little bit the situation that comes out of the modeling work that we do for Southeast Asia. And you can see there too, the scenarios indicate that the transforming energy scenario really holds a lot of promise for the region. Again, we would project a change in the composition really away from the heavy focus now on fossil fuels and including coal, of course, and really a tremendous amount of growth in the field of renewable energy, which would account for about 6.7 million jobs in 2050 out of a total of 10. So that's to our, I mean, since we are of course tasked with promoting renewable energy as an agency, that to us of course looks like very encouraging, very good news. I want to move on for the remainder of my time a little bit to just discussing, so what are some of the factors that ultimately really influence job creation in the renewable energy field. And this set of tiles really is just intended to sort of summarize a little bit the key factors, the key issues. And I'm not going to talk about all of that that's included in these tiles, but just to highlight a little bit. So of course, in the first place, the more that we see technological advances in renewables and the costs coming down, which has happened quite tremendously over the last decade, that allows renewable energy to be much more competitive and therefore allows countries and companies to really install much more capacity. So then, to the extent that happens, right, deployment, we need to look at both new capacities and of course cumulative capacity as well. In the former case, of course, this is really all the segments of the value chain, from project development to manufacturing to construction and installation. But then the cumulative capacity is where we get the jobs in operations and maintenance. Now, this situation is certainly not going to be static in terms of labor productivity, labor intensity. And we see, of course, already there is tremendous movement in terms of automation in manufacturing of equipment, particularly in the solar PV field. We see growing economies of scale, we see learning effects, and so this will continue to evolve, of course. But I think ultimately, you know, what's to us, to our way of thinking, what is really quite important is that we get the policies right, the policy making right. So we need clearly very strong deployment policies, whether that be still feed-in tariffs or auctions, fiscal and financial measures. We need a set of what we call integrating policies to help provide a predictable role for variable renewable energy, wind and solar, but also to really improve generally the flexibility of the grid and of our energy systems. And then what my colleagues and I in particular emphasize is we need to make sure that countries have the ability to create jobs domestically, right? And that very strongly depends on the structures of the economies, particularly the depth and capability of the domestic supply chains. So we need to look at things like commodity, technology, and trade dependencies, and to what extent they can be altered. And clearly, a number of countries have, with varying degrees of success, one has to say, tried to require certain local content requirements. So we have a number of experiences around the world. I think that more and more countries can learn from, and then that they can build on. And of course, and this is the last tile on this slide, we need to, of course, now shorter run. I mean, I've been talking about 2030 and 2050, but we need to, of course, now see how do we really manage to climb out of this pandemic crisis? What measures do we need to take in the short run, not to get us off track with regard to the energy transition, but also to make sure that economies can recover. And so we have actually done, we did a post-COVID recovery report in the middle of last year, where we applied a very similar model to the 2030, 2050 work that we're doing. And we found that with ambitious policies and ambitious investment levels, we actually can really accomplish that we can generate jobs even in the shorter run at fairly significant levels. And I think that's of course very encouraging news. So just as my last slide, I want to just sort of, in a sense, a little bit summarize the points I had in the previous one. We look at the different policy areas that are summarized here with these gears. And what we really try to highlight the most is to say, look, it's not so much an issue of this or that or the other policy. We have to really understand how they interact, how we can make sure that they actually don't work at odds with one another, right? That we actually see, that we approach policymaking in a very integrated and holistic manner. And I think to the extent that we manage that, we can actually make these model predictions come true, hopefully. So with that, I'm gonna end my presentation, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much, Michael. Really appreciated these insights. And actually, I have a number of questions that I want to ask, but we're going to leave that to after we've heard from all the speakers. It's really encouraging to see renewable energies really taking off now. Globally and in the region. And so a lot of exciting aspects, especially with respect to jobs. Now, we're really going to shift now. And so it's really exciting to talk about renewables, but we have to also look at what is in the energy system right now, the existing generation that exists, the amount of coal power especially. And if we don't find a way to address these issues, that is going to make either slow down or slow down the transition to renewables, or also just continue to create emissions. So our next speaker, Ms. Casey Ho, who's the Special Assistant to the Chairman of Prudential Insurance, will be speaking on this topic. And Casey's role includes research on a range of topics in Southeast Asia, including capital market development, insurance, and pension development, as well as environmental and social safeguards, investing in climate change, geopolitics, and trade. So she has a very broad outlook and quite a different outlook than I have as an engineer. So Casey, I want to turn it over to you, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, David, for the introduction, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So as David mentioned, my name is Casey, and I am Special Assistant to Prudential's Insurance Growth Markets Chairman. We have a few chairmen here, so just want to make that clear that I work for Don Kanak, who is the chairman of Insurance Growth Markets in Prudential. Prudential is a life and insurance asset management company with operations in 15 markets across Asia. For those of you who are in the Philippines, you might know us as PruLife UK. In other parts of Asia, you might see us as Prudential. But before I speak about our idea for energy transition, I'd like to spend a few minutes explaining who we are and why, as a life insurance company, we are interested in this topic. Some of you may know Prudential as a UK-based company, but after our UK business demerged in 2019 and shortly later this year when our US operations demerged as well, Prudential will become a truly Asian and Africa-focused company, which is where a lot of these coal-fired plants are located today. And where we operate in Asia, we are often one of the largest life insurance companies locally. And by virtue of that, often also one of the largest local investors or asset management companies. Furthermore, when we sell policyholders a policy, our financial responsibility to that person goes out for 20, 30, or even 50 years. And as a responsible insurance company, we want to match those liabilities with local assets with the same duration and the right risk return profile. And so that makes us a very long-term investor in local markets. And it is therefore in our natural interest that we want to see the communities that we serve and operate have a better environment, including in the aspects of energy transition and pollution reduction, etc. Over the years working in this region, Don and myself, we have witnessed the extraordinary rise of Asia's economic miracle, and also seemingly inevitable depletion of natural resources at the same time. And so we felt that something must be done to help steward the human impacts of climate change. And over the past few years, I worked together with Don to put forward an idea that might be able to address the situation quickly and at scale without requiring new technology. So why do we need an energy transition mechanism for developing countries? As some of you may know, emissions from existing coal-fired power plants alone will derail the 1.5-degree Paris Agreement goal. For example, coal-fired electricity alone will be responsible for 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions in 2018. But actually in 2050, for IPCC 1.5 targets for all emission sources, we can only emit 8.6. So if the current coal-fired electricity sticks around, we will just exceed 8.6 by 2050 by virtue of doing nothing. And to meet these targets, IPCC calls for coal-fired electricity to fall from 38% today to 9% of global generation by 2030 and virtually zero by 2050. However, despite these statistics, as we can see from the slide, coal-fired electricity is still very significant in many parts of the world. In US and Europe, we see it going down. However, if we look outside of these two regions, it's at most plateauing at, say, 40%, as you can see from the slide in the left-hand side. Furthermore, there are almost 1,000 new coal-fired power plants being planned or under construction globally today. So as you can see from the right-hand side of this chart, coal is still a very significant part of electricity in many developing countries' current electricity mix, and it is far, far higher than renewables. You can see the gap between the black bar and the green bar, where the black bar is coal percent of electricity and the green bar is wind plus solar today. This is made even worse because the average age of coal-fired power plants in Asia is just 12 years old. And these plants, they have a lifetime of 30, 40, 50 years, which means they will be well into operation in 2030 and maybe even into 2050 for some of these plants. The fact that these plants are still around causes a huge problem for renewables demand. Because the fact that they are here depresses the demand for renewable energy. If we look at the left-hand side of this chart, where each brown bar represents a coal-fired power plant running from today until, for example, 2060 at the bottommost bar, you can see that renewables is only added on the margin in this situation. However, if we can find a way to accelerate the retirement of coal-fired power plants, we create much, much more room for renewables to come in, not just incrementally, but to make a big difference. And here, just for illustratively, it might be at 2 to 3 times more demand for renewables. So it's really important that we retire the coal as soon as possible. Now, there are some voices in the investment community that say maybe we can just divest these coal-fired assets and they will go away. But unfortunately, based on what we've seen in the market so far, that's not really happening. Oftentimes, those that acquire these coal-fired power plants are less sustainability minded, and they might run these plants for their entire useful lifetime. So not sure that divestment is the only solution that we can look at. And furthermore, retiring these plans, they also must be accompanied by a plan to respond to potential disruptions in energy security and impacts on livelihoods, especially for workers and local communities that are dependent on coal. And so with these problems in mind, we were trying to look around and see if there's any large-scale ideas to tackle this challenge. And we couldn't find many. So we designed what we call the Energy Transition Mechanism, ETM. This piece of work was the accumulation of a few years of research, modeling, and consultation with stakeholders from many different fields of expertise, like power asset operators, multilateral banks like ADB, philanthropic organizations, local NGOs, etc. And when we designed the ETM, there were a few goals that we wanted to hit and a few challenges that we wanted to address. The first problem is that the decarbonization targets, they must be big and sizable, but also realistic with regard to the country's capacity and just transition challenges. Whatever plans that we put in place, they must be tied to national climate commitments and national energy, such that it stays in force. On top of that, the agreement must also give the host country confidence that the money will come to buy out the plants or help in transition, but it must also give confidence to investors in the vehicle that the coal-fired assets will be retired early with no new builds in the future. So this is a situation where we need a trusted neutral party with the appropriate legal and governance structure to enforce the deal. For example, a multilateral, as we'll explain in the next slide where we show the schematic. Another thing that is important is that this facility must have low cost of funds so that we can retire as soon as possible. The ETM is built upon the concept that you can retire assets faster with a lower required rate of return. If, for example, the previous owner wanted 10 to 15% return, but the ETM just needed 5%, the ETM would naturally be able to acquire and retire these coal-fired assets a lot faster. Therefore, the lower the cost of funds, the faster we can transition. And this also means that the ETM has to be able to access public sources of funding, including blended finance. This might sound impossible, but these days with developed governments able to borrow at zero or even negative rates, it might not be so impossible. And furthermore, COVID has showed us that developed country governments are willing to put out trillions of dollars of economic stimuli. Last time we looked, it was almost $8 trillion, which is huge compared to the 100 billion annually that was pledged by developed nations in the Paris agreements to help developing countries accelerate energy transition. And finally, we need to build out renewables rapidly while we are retiring the coal power at the same time. So with these goals in mind, we designed the ETM. This is the schematic that shows how it works, and I'll just walk through them one by one, step by step. So an ETM is a financial mechanism formed for a specific country. If it's a really big country, then we might look at provincial ETMs, but right now we're talking about national scale that is tailored to local conditions. It is made up of two complementary financial facilities, the carbon reduction facility on the bottom in the yellow box, and the clean energy facility in the green box at the bottom. As part of setting up the ETM as step 0, as I might call it, the ETM will need to agree with the host country on an energy transition plan that is consistent with the country's overall climate and energy plans. They will also need to agree on a method of enforcement with financial consequences of non-compliance or default by either side. The ETM agreements will need to prevent building up new coal-fired power plants merely to be purchased and retire. And the target set will be sizable, for example, retiring up to 50% of the current coal-fired capacity by a certain date, for example, 2030 or 2035. These elements gives investors confidence that the host country is heading towards a lower carbon future. Once these baseline parameters have been agreed, we can move on to step 1, where investors invest in the ETM. There are several different types of investors possible. They can be multilateral banks coming in with concessional lending or first loss guarantee, domestic and international private sector institution investors, and long-term investors with low-cost funds. These funds and the agreed energy transition plan will be overseen by we hope, a multilateral bank, but the bottom line is that it has to be a neutral, trusted party that both the host country and investors will be able to trust in. And here we think that a multilateral bank, one such as the ADB, they will have the neutrality and experience working with developing countries in infrastructure transactions to help ensure that the ETM can be conducted transparently and that the operators are responsible. With this set up, we can move on to step 3, which is where the owner of a carbon-intensive power asset contributes their asset towards the CRF in return for cash and potentially ETM equity. The cash that they receive can be used for just transition, or it can be used into CEF investments into renewables directly. The exact way that asset owners transfer their assets into the CRF will depend on local, legal, and regulatory conditions. In some places, this might be relatively straightforward and perhaps similar to setting up an infrastructure fund, whereas in other places where, for example, the asset is state-owned, then we'll need more creative structures to transfer ownership, whether fully or partially. These and other details will need to be worked out as we conduct feasibility studies in country. I also like to point out that the cash paid by the ETM to existing coal-fired power plant owners is not sunk capital in most cases and will create large and immediate new cash flows when they recycle these assets. And this cash will create jobs to aid in a post-COVID-19 recovery and accelerate the energy transition should the funds go into renewables. We believe that if possible, we'd like to build in incentives to recycle the funds that they get from the ETM into new green energy investment opportunities. After this, we move on to step 4, where the asset transfer is complete. The CRF owns the assets and they continue to operate it for a defined period of time that was agreed in step 0. Practically, this period of time will be less than the current expected useful lifetime of the asset, but also long enough for the investors in the ETM to get a reasonable return for their investments. Practically, for the power plant, nothing really changes on day 2. The plant still generates electricity, the workers still come to work. What has changed is the ownership, and that the plant has a shorter operating life, and there is a clear 10 to 15-year deadline to build up the renewables and close the plant. We've done some very preliminary financial modeling, and it indicates that at reasonable acquisition prices and at low cost of funds, the CRF should be able to run the plant for 10 to 15 years, generate enough proceeds to pay its investors, its new investors reasonably. Previously, we have assumed, for example, 5% return, and then retire the plant after, say, 10 to 15 years. This would significantly shorten the life of the plant, which originally had maybe 30 or 40 years lifetime. And meanwhile, in the same 10 to 15 years, in step 5, the CEF builds up renewables, storage, grid upgrades, etc. They do this through providing finance, technology assistance, and know-how to the host country. This is also another place where we think MDBs such as ADB will be extremely helpful in bringing their experience and their technological expertise. Private investors will also be welcome to invest in or alongside the CEF. Finally, with both CRF and CEF running, ETM investors can receive returns from both facilities. These cash flows, we think, can be further enhanced to achieve a faster and more just transition through carbon credits, diverting fossil fuel subsidies, energy surcharges, and maybe even performance payments for achieving specific environmental and/or social outcomes. This is the basic idea and the concept of the ETM. I've spoken quite a bit for now, but we'll stop at the moment, but I'm very happy to take questions later in the session. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Stacey. And I've had the chance to speak with you before about this, and definitely it has taken me some time to really appreciate this. How, you know, many people, and myself included at points in the past, said we just simply need to stop investing in coal. But this is a different way to invest in coal to retire it sooner. So it's a very different way and a very creative way of thinking. So thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm sure people will have many questions. I even have a few as well already. I will take this moment to mention to those watching, viewing this session, please feel free to enter questions into the Q&A chat box for the symposium. We will receive them and address them in the Q&A section after each of the speakers. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Krisnawan Anditya, who's the director of the Indonesian Various New and Renewable Energy Department. And Mr. Anditya has worked across a range of organizations doing both research, but also working research in different countries, but also working in Indonesia specifically on this topic of various new and renewable energy. And so I pass it on to you, Dr. Anditya.
Thank you, David. It is an honor for me to have an invitation from the ADB and to share the status regarding the energy transition toward the renewable energy in Indonesia. So allow me to try to touch about Indonesia energy context and then the energy transition toward the renewable energy, which is the other countries also trying to shift to using the new renewable energy. And then I will also try to touch about the regulation, the updated regulation that we expected will be stipulated soon, and then the closing. So perhaps maybe everybody already aware that Indonesia also have a commitment to reduce the green gas emission, which is already agreed during the what you call the Paris Agreement. And then the commitment of the Indonesia is also already stipulated under the law number 60/2016 about the ratification of Paris Agreement. And we already set the target with the what you call scenario one is the target is 29% under the BAU scenario. And if there is international support, then we try to increase to 41%. And then if you look at in order to reduce the green gas emission, then there is also contribution from the energy sector. So in order to what you call reduce the greenhouse gas emission by about 314 million ton CO2, this is actually under the scenario 29%. We will try to what you call implement development, energy efficiency, and energy conservation, as well as the implementation of clean energy technology. Just for give you the information about the status, Indonesia also already set the target for renewable energy share in the primary energy, national energy, primary energy, which is set to 23% by 2025. In last year, in 2020, our renewable energy share is just 11.2%, even though in the past 5 years, the trend of the renewable energy share tends to increase, but it's still what you call a long way to go to reach 23% of our renewable energy target by 2025, especially the time remaining time is only 4 years to go to 2025. So the government, the ministry is trying to focusing to develop renewable energy is a focus on fast installation and competitive price. Just give you the information, Indonesia actually the blessing countries. We already have many potential, huge potential of kinds of the renewable energy, from the ocean, geothermal, until the solar. You can see even though we have a huge ocean potential, but currently there is no project or power plant comes online. Most likely the ocean energy technology is under research and development. But we expect it soon, it will be, there is some project to be realized. You can see actually geothermal is our also potential is very huge, bioenergy, wind, hydro, and solar as well. Just give you the brief about what you call the achievement so far in the past 6 years related to the installed capacity of the new renewable energy in Indonesia. You can see here in the graph that last year, the installed capacity of the renewable energy in Indonesia already reached 10.5 gigawatt. And then it is always the tends to be increased. You can see from nothing, for example, like wind in 2015, we only have 1.5 megawatt installation, but until the end of 2020, it's already 154. The similar things is also happened in the solar development from 33.4 megawatt in 2015, now already 5 times higher than the previous ones. And then in the 2011, we already set the target of the installation of the renewable energy to be 11.4 gigawatt. So as I mentioned, Indonesia is also entering now the energy transition toward the clean energy. So the acceleration of the new and renewable development consider the reality of the energy needs and reasonable price by providing the first opportunity for renewable energy. And we are trying to also minimizing the intermittency factor and to mitigate if there is some potential to be developed in variable renewable energy. So we are trying to doing with this kind of 4 pillars. First is a primary final energy substitution. I will explain later on. And then the second, fossil primary energy conversion. And the third one is addition capacity of new renewable energy power plant. And the fourth one is non-electricity, non-biofuel utilization. If you talk about the primary final energy substitution, actually we are trying to save from the existing fuel to be using the green renewable without replacing the existing technology. So the activities or the program to be implemented during this program is first is using the biodiesel to ensure that the B30 program runs as a target. And then we also have a plan to develop to be B40 and B50 under supervision. And then the other things is we are trying to making the co-firing for the coal-fired power plant. As you may know that Indonesia actually, if you look at the composition of the power plant in Indonesia, most likely dominated by the coal-fired power plant, but we are now trying to push the what you call the developer, the generators, most likely the PLN, to making the co-firing in their own coal-fired power plant. At the moment, we already identified to 52 locations of coal-fired power plant. You can see here, there is 114 units for coal power plant with total capacity 18 gigawatt. And then we also trying to develop the RDF, refuse derived fuel opportunities, can be produced from various types of non-B3 waste, such as municipal solid waste or urban solid waste. So the total now is waste per year is, you can see the number 350 million tons per year hoarded in landfill. And the second one related to the shifting to the new and renewable energy. Currently, we are trying to what you call initiate the digitalization program. So we have a very huge number of this diesel power plant. You can see here in this presentation 5,200 unit diesel engine, most likely what you call located in the eastern region of Indonesia. So we are now trying to replace this kind of the diesel power plant with the renewable energy. It can be from the solar PV and then can be also hybrid or using the existing renewable energy in that location. For the first phase, there will be 358 locations with the total capacity 307 megawatt will be, it is already identified, and then will be converted to be solar PV with the BESS or the hybrid. And then the regulation, the assignment from the minister to the PLN to replace this kind of the diesel power plant is still being discussed and being prepared. And then in order to add the capacity of new and renewable energy power plant, under the draft National Green Energy Strategy, actually, the additional installed capacity of renewable will be 38 gigawatt by 2035. You can see here. And then we, as I mentioned before, the focusing of development of renewable energy will be fast, and that the most economist, and it most likely will be solar power. As I mentioned in the NRE is prioritas to be developed is solar power. And then the effort to accelerate, you can see we are trying to implement the president regulation related to a new and renewable price, and then develop biomass through energy, garden, forest, agricultural waste, and municipal waste. And then the synergy hydropower license is related to the water resource law, water fees and charge and land provision. And the other one, we are now trying to also having some discussion to construct a small scale nuclear power plants in remote system and improve the EMR regulation regarding rooftop solar PV. So this is actually the renewable energy electricity generation cost in the last 5 years. You can see the number here from the hydro, wind, geothermal, biomass, biogas, as well as the solar. I already mentioned that solar PV will be most likely to be developed more than rather than the others renewable energy. It is because Indonesia have a very abundant potential, and then the development is very vast. And then you can look at also the cost of generation cost is already declined with the capacity below 10 megawatt before is 25 cents, now already 10. And then above 10 megawatt before 10, now is a 5.8 cent. This is actually our first solar floating solar PV, Cirata, with capacity 145. And then just recently, we also have a proposal to develop a floating solar PV with the price is 3.8 and 3.7 per kilowatt hour. This is actually the program. So we are trying set up that the renewable energy to be developed more focusing to the solar PV. So there are 3 trends in developing solar PV in Indonesia. First, we are trying to massively develop rooftop solar PV. This is the number, the target of the rooftop solar PV development to be 2.1 gigawatt. We already identified the location to be put the rooftop solar PV. And then the achievement so far in the last year still small, only 21.4 megawatt, with the total numbers of customers is 3,007. And then the second one, this is actually similar things. The graph, the trend of the rooftop solar PV in the PLN already increased. And the second one, we are trying to develop a large-scale PV development. It's not just 1 megawatt, 2 megawatt, but more than 20 megawatt, or even 1 gigawatt, 2 gigawatt. We already identified the potential solar farm to be developed. One of them is a solar PV power plant in Nusa Tenggara Timur, Sumba, with the capacity potential is a 2 gigawatt. So since the Sumba Island is the demand is small, but now we have intention to to export this kind of electricity from solar PV in Sumba to Java. The study is now is under carry out. And the other one is a solar PV in West Kalimantan. And then we also already look at the power plant in Tin X Mining, located in Bangka, Belitung, with the capacity up to 1 gigawatt. as I mentioned, the price is less than 4 cents US dollar. They are already offering us 3.7 in the other side, and then the other is 3.8. And the other one is we try to also develop more solar farm in non-productive area and reservoir utilization. The third one that in developing solar PV in Indonesia will be floating solar PV. So we have successfully groundbreaking the first largest floating solar PV in the ASEAN with the capacity 145 megawatt. And we are trying to expand to other areas. We already identify the potential of the floating solar PV to be developed in the reservoir and the lake up to 28 gigawatt. And then we are trying to scrutinize filtering with the coexist with the hydropower plant. The capacity is up to 12 gigawatt. This is another program, non-electricity, non-biofuel utilization, such as we are trying to develop biogas, bio-CNG, electric vehicles as well, and energy efficiency energy. As a part to develop what you call renewable energy in Indonesia, of course, the good signal for the investor is how is the price. So in order to give the good signal of the investor, then we are already what you call drafting the presidential regulation related to power purchasing by PLN. So under this regulation, there are 3 schemes for what you call the tariff to be implemented in developing renewable energy. First is the feed-in tariff, which is applied for the renewable energy capacity up to 5 megawatt. And then the second one is the ceiling price, which is applied for the renewable energy with the capacities above 5 megawatt. And then the other one is agreement price or negotiation price. It is actually will be applied only for several type of renewable energy, such as hydropower plant peaker for all capacity, waste power plant, biofuel power plant, sea energy power plant for all capacity. And just for your information, actually, why the Indonesian trying to increase the level the regulation. Before the regulation for the pricing of the renewable energy just stipulated under the ministerial level, ministerial regulation. But now we are trying to increase to the residential level because we had already understand that the successfully implemented of the renewable energy development cannot be solely what you call to be handled by the Ministry of New Energy and Mineral Resources, but others related ministers' support is very needed. Then under this presidential regulation, we are trying to identify the responsibility, the role of other related ministries to participate in developing of renewable energy in Indonesia. So as a closing, Indonesia is committed to achieve 23% new and renewable energy target by 2025 as mandated by the National Energy Policy as well as a Paris Agreement. And renewable energy development will be focused on the one that could be installed quickly with the competitive price. And then as a support to develop a renewable energy in Indonesia, policy improvement will be the key to support the acceleration of energy transition toward new and renewable energy, including but not limited to the new renewable energy law, residential regulation on renewable energy processing by PLN, and MENA regulation on rooftop solar PV. That's all my end of my presentation. And then I'm glad if there is some question from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Anditya, for sharing with us the broad scope of work that's being done in Indonesia on renewable energy. And yeah, indeed, I look forward to discussing more with this in the question and answer period. Now, for our next speaker and our last speaker, before we go on to the question and answer, We're going to hear from Ms. Sarah Ahmed. She's a finance advisor to the vulnerable group of 20 ministers of finance of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And as this, she is also part of an advisory board to various institutions, including the Global Renewables Congress. And in these roles, she provides advisory support to governments and relevant partners on the energy transition, climate finance, and financial protection strategies. She is also a former energy finance analyst with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, covering energy transition in the Philippines. So Sarah, we very much look forward to hearing you speak, and again, bringing that down to the country level. So I pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, David. So I'll just quickly jump into it. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the Asian Development Bank for the invitation to be part of this conversation on power sector transition. The vulnerable group of 20 ministers of finance, the V20, represents 48 developing economies across Asia Pacific, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The V20 was founded by the Climate Vulnerable Forum under the presidency of the Philippines just 2 months before the Paris COP to translate the political agenda into real economy progress. So as we know, hard-fought development gains are being undermined or reversed by the pandemic, creating a potentially deadly dynamic if the 1.5 degree limit of the Paris Agreement is breached. We have already cost-effective technology in the form of renewables and storage and grid upgrades to displace high-emitting, volatile, expensive, and economically harmful fossil fuels. So my presentation today will focus on the options to transition to clean energy in the Philippines. But before I begin, I'd like to briefly touch on some context. So Southeast Asia has young populations, so job opportunities and cost competitiveness do matter today. Power tariffs are a pressure point, especially for countries that import a lot of their fuel needs. For example, the Philippines imports a lot of their coal and has a tariff of about 17 US cents. So the power planning community and globally significant financial institutions have now recognized the arc of technology development in renewables and storage will undermine the competitiveness and return on investment of fossil fuels. Considering the deflationary price trajectory of RE, it is therefore prudent to design the power system that encourages the use of modernized technologies in a way that can take advantage of improved pricing, reliability, reduced exposure to inflationary pressures, and international volatility. So there is an opportunity here to recalibrate markets, technology, and finance towards more resilient and sustainable economic futures. But it's clear that the recalibration cannot be on finance alone, as part of the transition must include the viability of the power sector through improved governance, reduced cost, improved resilience, and increased optionality for modernized technology options, so avoiding fossil fuel lock-in. In this case, both coal and LNG asset lives conflict with the arc of new technology development. The economic lives associated with the required investments in LNG infrastructure, LNG regasification, storage facilities, and pipelines are typically in the range of 25 to 40 years to meet traditional return objectives. The analytics most commonly used by industry advocates focuses on the interests of fuel suppliers, not the economics of establishing LNG as a component of the power system at a time of an energy transition. Something important to note as well is that outdated market management decisions have resulted in excessive reliance on imported coal, gas, oil, and diesel units with open-ended imported fuel obligations. As these options are increasingly uncompetitive and carry ongoing foreign currency and commodity price risks, does it make sense to have to continue such contracts, considering that suppliers have some element of influence on the prices on the JKM and other benchmarks? The lack of transparency means that it may make more sense to instead offer developing countries fixed prices and instead have the guarantee from JBIC or others go to the fuel supplier. So the goal really is to ensure that the market structures used to support these investments need to encourage players capable of taking market risk while domestic companies serving customers must have access to strategies for hedging risks to protect consumers who themselves lack the ability to manage destabilizing price and market risk. So this is just another slide on the technology opportunity and the growing importance of optionality. Battery cost deflation is steeper than wind and solar. The Philippine Electricity Market Corporation, PEMC, conducted a study on the impact on energy costs of the feed-in tariff program. It concluded that the wholesale spot market price would have been 5 pesos per kilowatt hour if there was no feed-in tariff qualified renewable energy plants in the system. But with the feed-in tariff renewable energy plants, the spot price was 3 pesos 55. This means it effectively reduced prices by 1.47 pesos, which is about 30%. So in the study, the savings applied to spot transactions was for about 30.2 terawatt hours from November 2014 to October 2015. And so in total, the cost avoided was about 44.3 billion pesos. So the FIT program cost 25.6 billion. So the net effect and the net savings or cost avoided in this period was 18.7 billion to the entire system. These are 2 figures here that show the opportunity for optimized competitive renewable energy zones for both solar PV and wind. The graph on the left here illustrates the comparative stability of offshore wind production to solar and onshore wind production. Offshore wind can provide a steady and reliable power generation profile that is comparable to conventional baseload generation plants, yet flexible enough to track demand behavior. The current technology, wind turbines already provide internal ancillary support, providing a regulated fee that supports the stability of the grid system. So now shifting over away from main grid now to small island grids. So over half the population of the Philippines, more than 50 million people, reside in isolated and island grids served by underfunded electric cooperatives that rely on diesel powered generation. Despite renewable energy viability in small island grids, the National Power Corporation Small Power Utilities Group, NPC SPUG in short, continues to install diesel gensets, growing the cross-subsidy requirements to reach electrification goals. It usually spends about $200 million per year on fuel costs alone. In 2021, NPC SPUG was aiming for a $300 million increase in the subsidy to be collected from all households in the country. As a government-owned corporation, NPC SPUG does not pay tax on fuel, yet there is an interest to double the fuel cost recovery. Considering that renewable energy is less than 2/3 the cost of diesel, it is prudent to halt new diesel power investments immediately and accelerate hybridization of solar, biomass, wind, as well as redirection of the cross-subsidy for renewable energy and storage. It may be beneficial here for the Asian Development Bank to work with the Department of Finance, who chairs the National Power Corporation Small Powers Utilities Group, NPC SPUG, to encourage modernization of the small islands and isolated grids in order not to cost the public an additional $300 million in fuel subsidies that are not taxed in any case. So moving on to transmission and ancillary services. So transmission planning is a key control lever that the Philippine government can use to influence the grid's capacity to prioritize domestic renewable energy and resources. A key opportunity is in grid modernization to allow for the power system to take advantage of rapid technological improvements to improve cost competitive and socioeconomic outcomes, as well as enhanced ancillary service market for ramping products, fast frequency response by batteries, as well as for new market participants to provide ancillary service such as wind turbines providing inertial response, solar PV and utility scale storage providing voltage support, and distributed energy resources providing frequency and voltage control. Moreover, there are more cost-effective or cost-competitive system options for balancing renewables. The argument that peaking gas units using LNG can be paired to support variable renewables is based on flawed analytics. there is a diverse range of technical strategies that can provide system balancing on a cost competitive basis and involving far less stranded asset risk that new consuming countries would face due to an LNG build out. In connection to this, there is a new Philippine transmission development plan. The consultation version is out, and there are two things that make me hopeful. One is the competitive renewable energy zones indicated, CREZ zones. The other is a smart grid pilot being done by the transmission operator. So a smarter transmission system can enable smart grids, better demand response, and user-to-user trading. We can now consider a situation where the grid operator enables a competitive landscape where distribution utilities are no longer natural monopolies. And grid modernization is having a transmission system that enables that. As our colleague from Irene had mentioned, another dimension of opportunity created through an energy transition is the strengthened employment. Specifically, the shift to RE has higher occupational intensity numbers than imported coal. And as was mentioned by our colleague who introduced the session, there needs to be an ability to respond to current and future interests and requirement of major companies and trade partners as they look to shift policies. For example, there's the renewable energy commitments, RE100 of major companies, net zero commitments by 2050, and the pending carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU and other economies in the future. So the question for us here in the Philippines is that are major companies and major economies able to reach their low carbon or net zero targets in this country, or will they have to look elsewhere, like in Vietnam, for example? And this is my final slide of both challenges and opportunities to deal with those challenges. So the market has been shaped by regulatory incentives focused almost exclusively on generation capacity rather than system level sourcing. So this has prioritized pricing strategies to mobilize capital for large volumes of baseload capacity, resulting in inflexible capacity payments and dependence on baseload coal technology. So green strategies now have the potential to unlock donor-based funding that could be meaningfully used to reduce Philippines' long-term power costs by ending its dependence on imported fossil fuels. Timely support for transitioning the energy system to the cost-effective technologies that are currently reshaping global power markets would foster more reliable and competitive power, but more importantly, bring with it employment opportunities. To build on the coal moratorium, the Philippines government now has an opportunity with support with the Asian Development Bank or from the Asian Development Bank to revisit design options for the market to benefit from new lower cost technologies to drive down the cost of power. So this slide illustrates the opportunities for engagement between the government and the Asian Development Bank moving forward, including policy support to the Energy Regulatory Commission to ensure that power purchase agreements are fairly vetted across the technologies, including fixed price and curtailment for expensive power, as well as small island grid and isolated grid diesel displacement strategies, and other listed on this slide. And with that, I'll end because I think we may be running over.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And to share some of the challenges and of course the opportunities in the Philippines. And so I'll ask all the speakers who are now in the panel to unmute. And I have some questions online, but also a number of questions that I have as well. And what I'd really like to do, I really enjoyed the overall framing of the opportunity and the challenges. And what I'd like to do in some of the questions is try to get into a little bit more detail. And I'll start with Michael. When you talked about, the transfer of jobs from, say, the fossil sector to the renewable sector, how does that work? You know, one of the challenges I've heard brought out in terms of, you know, you have a fossil industry in one side of the country and you have a renewable resource in the other side of the country. I've heard about that challenge, or you have different skill sets. And, you know, are there effective ways of reskilling being developed so that you can start to shift these from one industry to the other?
Thanks, David. I think you're pointing at something that's super important, and I sort of left that out in the attempt to be very brief in my initial presentation. But I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, there's no automatic transfer of jobs from one sector to another. I mean, I think there are discontinuities, there are misalignments potentially. Not just in terms of space, right? I mean, from one part of the country to another, or from one country or one region to another, but I think also in terms of time, right? The way this plays out, where new jobs in renewable energy are being created, this may happen, you know, slower or faster, and you know, different timescales than the loss of jobs elsewhere, right? So I think there are these discontinuities in time and space. I think you mentioned skills as well, of course, and I think it's skills as well as sort of the broader occupational and sectoral structures that we need to look at, right? I mean, what is really bound up in the supply chains for each of these energy technologies, right? So there are at least 4 different kinds of discontinuities that we need to look at. And I think the point is really to say, you know, that one can agonize over it, or one can try to develop policies, right? I mean, I think preferably we try to think about it ahead of time. You know, we try to understand, like, what will the skills needs likely be? You know, where are the skills gaps already, just in terms of sort of how many people do we need in solar and wind and biofuels and so on, but also in terms of discontinuities between the fossil fuel industries and the renewable energy industries. I saw recently a very interesting report that looked at the offshore sector in the United Kingdom. So not in Southeast Asia, obviously, but I think, you know, there are similar issues that apply around the world, one way or the other. And it looked at, you know, the possibility of reorienting to some extent and retraining people who are now in the offshore oil and gas sector to be able to work in the offshore wind sector, right? I mean, because there are many similarities between those two. And as a matter of fact, there's a report out, I forget exactly who put it out, but I think it's by 3 local organizations in the UK that basically actually interviewed workers that are in the oil and gas sector now, and that really indicated how much interest there is on the part of these people to say, you know, let's reorient ourselves, because we know we only have a limited time horizon. There is a boom and bust cycle in operation, particularly in offshore oil and gas, but I think that's generally true in much of the energy industry. And so therefore, let's really try to plan ahead. Let's have government provide opportunities for reskilling, you know, by putting up some money, by putting up programs that actually help accomplish that. And I think that's ultimately, I would think that's really key with all of these potential misalignments, right? That we need to really just think ahead, that we need to bring together the different actors and stakeholders that are relevant. So the companies in renewable energy, the companies in the traditional energy sector, but also educational institutions, regional and community organizations, labor unions, right? I mean, I think we need to really get much better and much more imaginative at how can we do this in a proactive way. So hopefully that answer wasn't entirely too long.
No, that's, I think it demonstrates the complexity of putting something like this into place. We see the opportunity, the numbers seem to strike in a way that shows, yes, this can work. All right, now, how do we make this happen? So thanks for that explanation. Now, the question I'm going to ask next to Casey, I'm going to ask for a reaction from you, Michael, when I come back. So I'm going to do a little circle here. Casey, how are you finding people reacting to this investment in the investment in coal? Because in a way, you know, the discussion has often been about, you know, let's take investments away from coal, but now we're putting them in as a way to orient them towards retirement and then towards renewables. How is that being perceived by people in the investment community and a broader stakeholder areas?
Thank you for the question. I have to admit, it's quite difficult. We first came up with this draft idea in around 2018, and back then this was called the coal retirement mechanism. And we did a round of stakeholder engagement, and many of the people, almost everybody we talked to, they said, this is a great idea, it's scalable, it's visionary, it's practical, it works right now with the current technologies that we have, but investing in coal, even to retire it, is just not palatable to their own investment mandates or even to their shareholders. So we wrestled with that problem with quite a while, and eventually, with a lot of stakeholder input, we added this element we incorporated the element of putting in renewables into the structure, baked into the structure, instead of it being a separate facility. And then we rebranded it as the energy transition mechanism early this year. The atmosphere has changed a lot since 2019 to late last year, and even now, the conversation has really changed, and people are starting to get aware that divestments alone won't solve the problem. We have to get rid of the coal in order to transition. So there's a real change in the atmosphere of how they perceive coal. We also have had some discussions with people in the carbon credits world. The ETM is not dependent on carbon credits as we design it right now, but we did have some discussions with people in that field, and the views were quite polar as well. Some people say this is a wonderful idea, it's verified, it's high quality, it's additional, it's permanent, the plant is here today, it's gone tomorrow. We think it can qualify for carbon credits. There are people in the other camp that say, this is investing in coal to get rid of it. Not quite sure. So now there are different views, and we're still trying to convince people, but right now we're very happy to see momentum gathering in getting rid of coal, not just by divestment, but by other means as well. I also want to react a little bit on Michael's point about providing just transitions. We also like to think of this way is not just transitions into jobs in the renewable energy sector, but also more broadly into the overall circular economy, where there might be more opportunities there. And regarding the point on timelines, this is also why we built the ETM the way that we did, which is having 10 to 15 years to transition. We realize that jobs can't be created overnight. People just can't get retrained immediately. And the system in general needs time to retire one thing and build up another. And so this is why the mechanism comes in with this design of buying it up, running it for 10 to 15 years, and then retiring it, giving ample time for all parties to get prepared for the new future.
Right. No, thank you for that. And that's, I think it is well thought out, as you said, and I'm really glad that those considerations have entered into it very early on. And then also, yes, I think there is going to be some continuing need for education. And that's why it's not meant to be unfair, Michael. I want to just ask, as a person focused primarily on renewables, I'm just curious how you react to just a short intervention of how you react to a mechanism like this.
Yeah, I mean, I should say that I know very little about the world of finance, so I should be very careful what I say. I realize, there is sort of an approach that says like, yeah, ideally we'll do X, right? But then the real world dictates that you can't, that you have to find different ways. And I think in that sense, I really appreciated Casey's presentation a lot, that we have to find ways around the obvious obstacles that are out there in the real world, right? I mean, you can't just say, ideally we'll just, snap our fingers and tomorrow it's all gone or it's all changed around. So in that sense, I completely get it. I mean, I would still hope that we can maybe over time, and I think you're right, Casey, I completely agree. This all takes time in thinking about it and putting policies in place and seeing them actually through. But I would hope that we can actually rely more strongly as we move forward on public policies as well, that we don't have to rely necessarily on private financing models, as good as they probably are, right? That we can say, look, governments are promising certain things under the NDCs and under the Paris Climate Agreement. Let's maybe have them translate that in the different ways so that we can actually speed up the phase out of coal as well. So I'll leave it at that, I think.
Well, thanks for that reaction. And I know it's a tricky question, especially someone so new, but I just wanted to take this opportunity. So thanks for being willing to comment. For Chris Nawan, you shared a lot of different examples of the work that's going on in Indonesia. And one of our attendees said, why RDFs and waste to energy? And they expressed a concern of that being a dirty energy, potentially even dirtier than coal. And I'd be really curious to hear your understanding of those two technologies, or how they can be applied in Indonesia in a way that really contributes to clean energy.
Okay, thank you. So before I answer that your question, I will try to give you the what you call the back history of the Indonesia when we are trying to develop the coal. You know, 20 years ago or 25 years ago, our electrification ratio is very low. So in that time, we are trying to what you call struggle to electrify our people with what you call enough the electricity. And since the Indonesia, the population of the Indonesia is a very huge, then in this case we need a huge of energy. And the one that our thinking in that time to fulfill the electricity need is it come from the coal. Why the coal? Because the Indonesia in that time we have a very abundant of coal. And then in that time, the cost is very low compared with others energy in that time. And then the capacity to be developed, it can be bigger, can be fit with the very huge people. So in that time, we are trying to develop coal, but starting in 2011, we are trying to consider about the environment aspect, because when we are trying to make it make it balanced in affordability, accessibility, and environment aspect, then we need to also look at that. We need to consider about the environment aspect. So in that time, starting 2011, we are trying to push. Even though the Indonesia is still trying to develop coal-fired power plant, but in that time, there is some policy from the government that the coal-fired power plant to be developed should be using the clean coal technology. So the CCT, in that time, there are several projects of coal power plant using the what you call ultra supercritical, which is emit the emission less than the conventional one. And then suddenly the global environment already shifting once the Paris Agreement, our president already showing the commitment to reduce the emission by 29%. Then we are now trying to thinking, and at the same time, our electrification ratio is already increased. For your information, last year, our electrification ratio already reached 99.8%, meaning that we are already having enough sufficient electricity to the people. Of course, there is some a few people need to be what you call take care, because they are living in the very scattered areas and a very difficult situation to provide the electricity. Then in that time, we are trying to also develop the diesel power plant. But in the later on, it will be making suffer for our state budget, because the subsidies for this kind of the fuel is a very huge. That's the situation. So, since Paris Agreement, we have a commitment, then this is we think is a right time. Then we are trying to shift. We are ready to set up that yes, this is our time to boosting renewable energy development. But in the other side, the remaining coal-fired plant still exists. So we are trying to push them again. At least the project, the power plant belong to KLN, the state-owned enterprises, should be taking what you call the mix with the biomass through the co-firing. So I already mentioning that 52 location with the total unit of coal-fired plant, 114 units need to be using the what you call mixed with the biomass. So this is the one step that we are trying to shifting to the renewable energy, because the coal industry still exists. There is some employee up there. Then we need to gradually to what you call to shifting to the renewable energy later on. And we also already identify the old one coal-fired power plant that can be put it in our phasing out program. So we already set up that the coal-fired power plant that is already operation for 30 years need to be replaced with the renewable energy. So this is the step-by-step approach to be what you call to be addressed by to be taken by the government, because we cannot instantly change with the one technology to other technology. There is some what you call transition. Then transition should be smoothly and should be aware by the other sector, not only from the renewable energy, but also there is some time, there is a room for fossil power plant need to be adjusted. And now we are also already asked them in the site of the coal power plant, they should be developed as well solar PV. So part by part, side by side, at least while the operation time of their own power plant still exists, then at least they are trying to making some contribution. 10% of the total of their land area need to be developed with the solar PV. This is the some approach that we are already doing in the transition mode to the renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. And I think it is important to speak to the history, and it's a challenge. The rapid change in technology development and cost reductions is exceptionally exciting, but it requires change en masse in design and in mindset in countries, and that can take some time. And I wanted to go to you, Sarah, and see if you can speak to that. You talked about the economic drivers that show clear paths for the Philippines. I think to one of your later comments when you talked about the small system needs in remote communities where they're still building standalone diesel generators. What do you think is the biggest challenges in shifting to more clean energy solutions if the economics or the finances are there already? What are the biggest challenges in the Philippines?
Thanks, David. That's a good question. I think the main challenge sits in the procurement. So while we have obvious price trends and obvious gains to be made by shifting, the procurement policies are quite outdated. And so you're trying to procure renewables and match it with the profile of coal or diesel. For NPC SPUG, the state-owned enterprise that's investing in diesel, it's a matter of business as usual. There is no incentive to save costs or to reduce costs for other ratepayers, other than if they don't get the budget. So I think in terms of where the Asian Development Bank could be most helpful would be in procurement, which would then sit with the Energy Regulatory Commission as one of the key actors to engage with.
Right. Do you see any challenges on capacity? Especially in I'm focusing on remote communities, but then equally within the existing system. I know you're a financial specialist, but do you see any technical limitations or capacity to understand what the opportunities are, or is that sorted already?
So there's obviously room to match the transmission investment with where renewable energy sources are located. But in terms of the capacity of the grid, I believe NREL and USAID came out with a study called Greening the Grid and found that there could be up to 50% of variable renewables that the current grid could absorb. And right now, I believe the Philippines is just over 3% of variable solar and wind in the supply mix. So there's quite a lot of opportunity. And I think in terms of the small island areas, the diesel gensets run 7 to 8 hours, and you typically don't know when they're going to turn on. But if we were to put solar, for example, there, you would know when the power is on. It would be when you see the sun. So there is more predictability in the case of renewables than this diesel strategy. So I think this is something that could be done in the near term for the Philippines.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. I want to go back to Michael. You've heard the other speakers. What advice would you want to give to countries, and it doesn't have to be Indonesia or the Philippines, but in Southeast Asia, let's try to focus. What are the key pieces of advice you would focus on to really accelerate this transition? And we've seen that these countries are, heavy on fossil fuels today. How would you suggest they work to accelerate? Because we're hearing lots of great opportunity. We're hearing lots of great work. How could they accelerate them?
Thanks, David, for the question. I think, in general, what my colleagues at ARENA argue, in terms of these scenarios that I talked about briefly in my presentation as well, is it's of course key to basically to have a strong investment strategy, right? To ensure that renewable energy does get the support that it needs, that we do not, this goes back a little bit to what Casey was talking about as well, that we do not keep investing certainly not in new coal capacity or in too much in oil and gas. But I realize, I think probably for many countries, that's very difficult because they may say, look, there are upfront costs. You're telling me down the line there are good benefits. The costs are coming down of renewables, but I'm still having a difficulty of actually marshaling the funds necessary to do this, to do what you telling me to do, right? So I think there needs to be more of a strategy. I think together with ADB, I would think, or with other actors, to say, how do we come up with a concerted plan to actually make that happen, to actually enable the financial streams to go into the right direction. I'm not very good with finance at all, so I probably shouldn't talk much about that. I really look more at, if we do certain things, what does that potentially entail in terms of translating into jobs, and what kinds of policies broadly do we need to enable that, right? And again, in terms of sort of skilling, in terms of labor market policies, in terms of social protection actually as well. So I realize it's it's very easy for people like me to say, well, you should do X, right? But the actual means have to be marshaled. So I'm not sure I'm very qualified to talk about that, to be honest with you.
Well, thank you for your honesty. And I think, again, I absolutely see the value of, having this high level view and also this on the ground view to really bring those together. I think that's where the most powerful solutions can come together. And Casey, I want to kind of go a little bit on this line. When you talk about the social justice element of the energy transition mechanism, do you have any idea what level of scale that can be part of it? Because it is going to be large amounts of money And I know it's early days and you might not be ready to answer that, but just curious to get a sense, you know, do you see this as being 50% of the funds? Probably not, but do you have an idea on that or how that can be developed?
So we haven't done much work on that area yet, I have to admit, but judging by the size of the funds needed to retire these coal-fired assets and that these funds can go towards building new renewables and partially towards just transition, it can be quite sizable. So for example, taking a country like the Philippines, for example, which has, let's say, 10 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity today, if we want to retire half of that, that would be 5 gigawatts. And depending on what acquisition multiples you use, this fund would be easily in the billions of dollars. So that is a lot of money to go towards renewables building up and towards just transition. How that ratio splits, it would have to depend on the negotiations with the national government that I described in step 0 of my schematic. Some governments may want to focus more on one or the other, and it's very hard for us outsiders to tell them, hey, you should do more of this and less of that. It really depends on the local context and what the national government wants to focus on. But bottom line is, it's huge sums that need to be involved, whether it's retiring it, building up the new renewables, or in helping these communities. So this will be very large scale if it works.
Yeah, great. No, thank you for that, and that's a very good point of trying to find those solutions together, and not coming in with the solution when you don't have a full appreciation to the comments or to the context on the ground. And I think Chris Nawan highlighted that before, giving that history of the energy sector development on the ground in Indonesia. So now we're actually coming close to our close. So I'd like to give both Sarah and Chris Nawan one last comment as well. So I'd say, what to both of you, you know, what do you think is needed to accelerate this transition? One or two things that you think are needed really in the two countries you're talking about that can really accelerate this transition to clean energy in a just and inclusive manner. So I'll go just out of order for now. I'll go Sarah first, and I'll go to you, Chris Nawan, next.
Thanks, David. So the two key things, one is procurement, which I'd highlighted earlier, and the second one is grid governance, because the Philippines, you know, if it had better control over its grid, could potentially have better options on what or where power could be procured. So a lot of the issues that renewable developers are facing is inadequate grid that links to their plant. And so if there was a little bit more, I guess, planning on the grid side to match with renewable energy, so through the CREZ zones, which is now in the updated transmission plan, this could open and pave the way for renewables to enter the system a lot quicker.
Thank you for that. And Chris Nawan.
Okay, thank you. You already aware that during in my presentation that the renewable energy to be developed in Indonesia will most likely focusing on solar PV. So the penetration of solar PV in Indonesia is also will be increasingly rapid, very big. So similar with the Sarah already mentioned, Indonesia, the penetration of VRE in the electricity system is also challenging. And in this case, we need some support, help from other countries and also the ADB to doing study about the grid stability when the penetration of VRE will be increased dramatically. That's the one that we need your support. The other things, you know, the investment needed in the transition of energy is very huge. And in this case, we also need the support, the funding, the investment scheme from ADB. especially when you can provide us with the funding or investment in providing and in preparing the feasibility study of the renewable energy. That's will be useful for us, at least when this potential already exists, and then we are doing a feasibility study with the support with the financing from the others countries or institutions like ADB. Then the realization or the implementation to be commercial of this project will be what you call closely. That's my comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that comment. And I think, you know, as I hear these, you know, the work we've discussed today, from the coal retirement mechanism and supporting jobs development, and then lastly, the two, you know, key opportunities to accelerate things in the Philippines and Indonesia. You know, it's such a big stakeholder group that we work with. ADB, thank you for mentioning ADB and the work that we do. But indeed, we are working closely with many development partners, and you know, multilaterals and bilaterals from different countries. And it really is work that we all must do together and with a range of actors to really make this happen. So I'd like to thank you all for participating in this. I really enjoyed the discussion and the information that you've shared. I've learned a lot today. For those who are continuing on to the next session, we're going to take about a 15-minute break, and then we're going to start out that session on ADB's energy policy consultation. So thank you very much to our speakers and our participants. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Yong Ping Jai, Chief of Energy Sector Group. I'm very happy to be with our speakers here today in this session on ADB Energy Policy Consultation. A little bit background before we proceed with speakers. The background is that ADB has its policy, energy policy, dated 2009. It's 11 years old, and since then there's tremendous changes, as you know, in terms of the energy sector landscape. A lot of new technologies emerged, and the cost of renewable energy have come down dramatically. And also during these 10 years, last 10 years or 11 years, and there have been global commitment, as we know, as Paris Agreement and also Sustainable Development Goals. And to align with our policy with this development and the global commitment, we are going to actually this year, we are revising and updating our energy policy. To do so, we would like to have a series of consultations with all stakeholders. For the last 6 months, I've been doing consultations with over 16 sessions, over 200 people, different countries, different experts, industry players, academics, professors, all kind of different stakeholders. I requested, actually for this forum in Southeast Asia, I requested a session on energy policy consultation. I think that this is very relevant for the region, and very relevant for me, also important for me to get views from our distinguished panelists today. And the key question for us to understand is, if Asia wants to move away from coal, for example, and this is one of the key issues here, and what are the technologies we can rely on, the countries could rely on. And energy, as should be there to support different other sectors. So how energy would work and support other sectors like transport, education, health sector, for example. Now the pandemic is still ongoing, and how the energy sector can help to ensure the cold chain for transportation of vaccines, for example. And talking about vaccines and how energy sector should react and respond to the pandemic, and that's going to be stay for a long while. I think I've been myself working from home for exactly 1 year as of today. So how energy sector will be able to respond to these challenges. So these are some of the questions so we would like to reflect during the process of energy policy updating. So without further ado, I would like to actually go to our panelists to hear from their views, and also would like to hear from them what would be the requirement from their perspective on ADB, what ADB should do, and how ADB can do better. So without a little introduction, a short introduction, I would like to invite our first speaker in my list, Dr. Nuki Agya Utama, Executive Director, ASEAN Center for Energy. Dr. Nuki, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yongping Zai, for this very great opportunity, inviting us to this session. Indeed, it is very, very interesting question that you just raised on how the region are facing the new era on decarbonization, or the way that we pursue on the reducing our reliance on the fossil fuel. Indeed, it is a very tough question. As you may know that our region has launched our ASEAN Energy Outlook 6 last year during ASEAN Energy Minister meetings in Vietnam, November 2020. Over there, we also predict in the next 20 years, up to 2040, the region still rely heavily on the fossil fuel, both in the power sectors as well as the transportation sector. On the power sector itself, the predicted demand will be increased more than twofold, including in the industrial sectors as well as residential sector, which is the highest is the industrial sectors. I think it's very, very interesting to see what is going to be in the futures and what measures that we need to take. First of all, in regard with the new technologies or the innovation that we need to achieve decarbonization, we discussed a lot on the possibilities of the small medium reactors on the modular parts for the reducing the carbon emission in the power sectors. And also we try to increase the share of the natural gas to replace the current coal power plant. And we also talk on the CCUS perspective, not only the carbon capture, but utilizing and storing for the next couple of decades. However, in on the transition itself, it is very important not to avoid the current existing power plant, which is we still have plenty of newly built coal power plant, for example. So on that sense, we try to introduce the high efficient and low emission type of power plants, such as the supercritical, and also the potential on including the biomass with the co-firing technology. So that's on the power sectors. In regard to these transportation sectors, we try to increase the share of biofuel and biodiesels. Since 26% in 2040, the share of the energy coming from these transportation sectors. So of course, the whole perspective of energy, we need also to consider not only the supply side, but also the demand side, which is efficiency is one of the things that we need to do. The innovation on the battery and the technology introduction on the replacing the current silicon wafers into the perovskites, for example. And also we need to consider to improve our current grid and introducing smart grid into the region. And as you know also that we have a good, very, very big plan on the ASEAN interconnection grid, which already being implemented in the last 2 years for the connection between Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and last year with Singapore, and maybe the coming years with Indonesia. I think the whole, this thing we cannot explain it in a few minutes, but that's the whole key takeaways updates coming from our regions. Thank you.
Sorry very much. Sorry. I would like to thank Dr. Utama for his remarks. I said also that after hearing from other speakers, I would like to come back to Dr. Utama on some of the specific examples. Say, let's take one country example for you to prepare. Let's take Indonesia or any other country in the region as one example. How is it possible and how fast these countries or one of these countries can move away or cannot move away depending on situation to low carbon systems. So let's take Indonesia, for example, in the second round of your remarks. So with that, I would like to move to our next speaker, Mr. Dr. Ambu Morsi, who is a senior energy economist, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Dr. Ambu, please.
Thank you, Dr. Zai, and good morning or good evening or good afternoon to the participants and also fellow panelists. I basically appreciate Dr. Zai's initiative to bring the new energy policy for ADB, which is already 11 years old. Basically, there are 4 questions that this consultation process wants to address. So I will bring some of these our perspectives on these 4 questions. The first one is what are the emerging technologies, and the second is what are the cross-sectoral issues. Third one is the long-term impact on the COVID, and finally, what could be the needs and the priorities of the developing countries. All these questions are very complex, and there is no simple answer. Given that, basically, I would like to bring a kind of a new or 3 imperatives for this new energy policy should look into it, and as well as the 3 new emerging opportunities that new policy could look into it. And also during this process, I will share some of the surveys that is being done by area and what are these constraints or the barriers for this upscaling these energy investments. My first imperative for the new energy policy is that is it should be the human focus. That is humanizing this energy access. And I think we know that is the ADB is a very crucial and support to these developing member countries to lifting millions of people out of the poverty. But this is a partly told story. And still, we can see that is the substantial part of the population still have the difficulty in accessing to these clean and energy sources. And if you look into this region, particularly Southeast Asia, still most of the countries has this electricity consumption is per capita energy consumption is very low. So this per capita energy consumption is directly related to the Human Development Index. That is the welfare, human welfare. I think here the first narrative comes for this ADB, how they are going to provide this new clean energy. And these countries, this population has all the right to catch up their counterparts in the advanced economies who are consuming more energy and having the higher development index. So first imperative is how this energy mixes will be and what could be the affordability and then accessibility and the sustainability. That need a clear look into this, what kind of energy mix the countries and the regions has. Second thing is ADB is the current policy framework is also, I think, starting from 2016, ADB is providing a lot of the technology and the financial assistance to realign that energy policies towards the long-term goals of the climate change. But here the challenge comes here is, I think most of these Paris climate agreements, as reflected in the NDCs, focusing more on the improving this energy efficiency and increasing this renewable energy share. That means it is really ADB policies look for increasing this or improving that energy intensity. But if you look into this COP25 next year, there may be changes in these NDCs. Then the new energy policy to make into that kind of reality, that is how this carbon intensity is going to be changed, and what could be the role for this ADB support, for which will be a kind of more complex. You know, there is the difference between this energy intensity and the carbon intensity. So we need a structural changes. How this new ADB policy is going to impact these structural changes is a kind of a challenge that we need to look into it. Third one is almost in this part of this region, particularly Southeast Asia, and almost all the countries has been implementing these energy sector reforms. Basically, that is, if you see, there is the one of this is the energy efficiency. We had seen these targets. Now ASEAN has collectively improved these energy efficiency targets, and also at the national level we have these renewable energy targets. But to my sense, and these two are the kind of low-hanging fruits. Basically, the countries has already done it, but the more challenging part is how this end-use fuel switching will happen. So this is a kind of an area where ADB's new policy could look into it, which is a really hard energy sector reform is needed. That need not only for the supporting this R&D, but who is going to pay for this financial incremental cost, whether it is a multilateral institution or the national government or the common public. And we also have this transfer of the technology challenges and the new emerging technologies. So these are the three imperatives that ADB's new policies should look into it, or should at least to debate it. The next is the opportunity, and Dr. Zai mentioned which technologies could replace the coal, and here the answer is not very clear, and there is no silver bullet, but this emerging evidences, so that is there are some of the technologies which has their revealed comparative advantages when compared to the coal. And they also can support some kind of new innovation, or the kind of innovation network within the country and across the countries. Here we see that is a very clear picture, and we see within the Green Innovation Index from 1 to 2, we found the smart grids, photovoltaics, and storage and road transport. They have more comparative advantages, but they need to be upscaled, and it has to be absorbed at the economy wide. So this have things, and also we have that next layer, we do have a kind of wind and the clean coal or nuclear. And here we need to see there is what could be the comprehensive strategy to look into it, and what could be the comparative advantages that brings this industry, these technologies can develop the new jobs. And the next question is what could be the cross-sectoral issues? And here my take here is that is now ASEAN is thinking about this developing a long-term policy framework for circular economy. And if you see the circular economy is a kind of a new economic model that has been emerging out in Europe and other countries that could be applicable, and that has a different meaning for the energy sector. If you look into the energy sector, and this circular economy could be an enhancer for cleaner energy transition, if we have a focus on waste to energy projects, or more in this Southeast Asia, more agriculture biomass are there, and so it could be a kind of a circular economy concept bringing the distributed energy systems. And if you look into the fossil fuel, it could be a kind of a carbon recycling process, that how we can better use of this CCU, natural gas, and also small scale reactors. So circular economy is one of the key cross-sectoral issues that is emerging out that could be harnessed from the perspective of developing member countries. The second cross-sectoral issue is at the regional level is this ASEAN Smart City Network. There are already 26 cities that has been committed for the smart city, basically introduction of these ICT technologies. And here we did, basically so far this ASEAN Smart City Network is thought, or it is assumed to be a kind of investment platform. but it provides an opportunity, and there are some estimations available. If this application of these ICT technologies is introduced and upscaled at the city level, and we can find about energy consumption, energy efficiency could be improved by 4 to 7%, and then it could be also resulted in about 17% of the emission reductions, and it has multiple co-benefits. So I think these are the two areas where this new energy policy could look into it and develop a new financial mechanisms to support these developing member countries. And the third question is, what could be the long-term impact of COVID? And we need to acknowledge the fact that the pandemic is far from over. And this is what happened during this 2008 crisis. And we found at this regional level, this is the kind of estimation for the ASEAN plus 10 countries. And basically, about 1% reduction in the energy use has been observed during this 2008 crisis, but it is much more. But there is, in this last year, 2020 itself, this COVID has a very transformative story to tell. And here the sign that is the lockdown has resulted in this reducing the energy demand. And we also find work from home models, and this could be a kind of structural change. And we are not sure basically how these business models will be resting in the future and how permanent it will be. But but the digitalization has happened, and within the 1 year we can find that is this transformation has been shrinked basically within a year. And we also see that is the resilient energy. That is the, Dr. Zai mentioned about this cold storage for this vaccine. But in the first half of 2020, we see that is how that is energy supply was resilient to supporting the health sector. And also during the last year itself, China and Japan and Singapore has announced this net zero targets. So this transformative has some implications. And this, how permanent this transformation or will be a kind of impact that is we need to study, and we need to see that is the future opportunities, as well as there is a possibility that is we may come back to this return to this original, because with some cities and some countries this rebound effect has already been observed. Then another important thing that is we need to see is this impact financing. And IRIA has did a survey that is what are the investor perception of the demand and the readiness for this clean energy investments. Basically, we contacted about 2,000 investors, bankers, as well as the project developers. This is the perception basically they have about it. I think within the ASEAN and the plus 3 countries, and or you can say this ASEAN plus 6, most of them see that is a demand immediately after signing into the Paris Agreement. Nearly 70%, most of the 70% of these investors, they see a demand for these low carbon investments. Some of them also see that is a coal investment is going to be a standard assets. But if you think whether you can invest on it, but here they tell this complex story. That is the readiness to make the investment is effective if there is a de-risking mechanisms are available. And here they are very clear, and here they expect much more role from the governments and as well as these international financial institutions like ADB. And this is also, this is as a part of the study, it happened before the COVID, and we asked these investors, about 300 people, and what are the areas that is region can cooperate together, the countries and the private sector can cooperate together. And this is the findings of this perceptual survey, and as President mentioned yesterday morning, and there are 6 areas that is they find there is much more cooperation. One is that is the carbon pricing. Here, no country is wanted to go alone for the carbon pricing because it has the competitiveness. Second thing is most of the private sectors wants to have a kind of energy transition project and fund, basically regional fund. And the third one is they want more kind of a financial warranty program. So for example, it exists in the mining sector, but they wanted to have it for these renewable energy programs or the energy efficiency programs. And also they find a kind of regional regulations on the energy financing services. And also there is an expectation for having a kind of clear taxonomy for the green bonds, because so that is how this proceeds of these green bonds can be here. Here there is a much more role for these regional institutions like ADB, where we are bringing this more harmonization of these standards on the taxonomy. This is my last concluding slide, and that shows that is the basically to address the question, what are the needs and the priorities of the developing countries? Here, I don't want to pretend to be a kind of representative of all these diverse economies, but this is a kind of sample that is we got it, and from this from the investors, what are these opportunities to mitigate this investment risk? And here, most of these investors, they think this power purchase agreement, but that is the kind of risk mitigation mechanisms. And the second factor comes is about the long-term policies, particularly this energy efficiency. And the third one is most of them, they think that is the government guarantees are needed, because nobody wants to be the first loser when there is the viability gap in investing these clean energy projects. And I think equal number of stakeholders agree that is the fossil fuel subsidies remain as a kind of a challenge. So having this kind of perceptual capture and what could be this new ADB energy policy could look into it. And here I have a kind of 4 agenda that ADB can look into it. One is that is the how this energy sector policies see that is distribution systems, how this more investments could be done into these the energy systems, where this still most of these utilities are the public sector undertakings. And secondly, the circular economy system. So how we can enable more investments that needed from the institutional investors and the bond markets. I think that this new energy policy could look into it. And the third point I would like to miss is to look into this SMEs and the smart cities, particularly enhancing this energy efficiency. That need a completely different type of ESCO models. And the smart cities, as I mentioned, it provides an opportunity, this application of the digital technologies to improve the service delivery. That need a kind of a new innovative financial mechanisms, because these cities, the financial capacity of the cities are very much limited. And third one is this new policies also emphasize the sub-regional cooperation like Greater Mekong region and also CADEC programs. But here we need that is the investments getting into the cross-border investment is risky. And still considered to be a kind of risky investment from the institutional investors. Maybe like this Laos and Thailand model could be looked into it, how it could be upscaled, and also what type of tax structures could be thought about it. And these are the kind of 4 broader areas that ADB's new energy policies could look into it, and much more debate could be done. And so I stop here, and once again thanking the ADB for having this opportunity to share our thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ambu. Just a quick question. Did you use, were you using a PPT presentation, or you were just talking out of your, without notes?
So I'm using PowerPoint. You have not received it? You have not seen it?
No, I didn't see it. I can see reflection in your glasses. You was having some PPT, but I couldn't see on screen my side. But anyway, I thank you for covering so comprehensively all my questions. I would like to come back to you if we still have time for second round for a specific question to you. You mentioned reforms, right? You know, in the earlier generation of market-oriented reforms, actually, you know, with unbundling of the power systems, you know, the regulations, and cost recovery tariffs and so on. So this kind of reform we have went through, but given the new requirement of the climate actions to meet the target of low carbon transition, even the new carbon neutrality in the future, what kind of a new generation of market reform, if any, as an economist, what would you say? Because we need to see beyond the unbundling, beyond independent of regulation, beyond what we knew, what would be the your advice on a new generation of market reform? So prepare yourself, and let me move to Dr. Philip Andrews Speed, who is the head of Energy Security Division, Energy Studies Institute, National University of Singapore.
Thank you, Dr. Jai. Good afternoon, everybody. Looking at the ADB document, what are ADB's guiding principles as it updates the energy policy? I'm going to address briefly three of them: the policy commitments of the relevant ASEAN member states, social safeguards, and the economic dimension under I suppose three topics. One is the pandemic, which has just been mentioned. Secondly, addressing the interests of the fossil fuel community, which was addressed in the previous panel, I wish to expand upon, and the issue of transaction costs of renewable energy. So the pandemic, here at Energy Studies Institute, we've just completed a study for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, looking at the impact of the pandemic on renewable energy in Southeast Asia, also India and China. And we saw the short-term impact was, yes, as demand fell down, then the share of renewable energy increased a bit. Because there were some obligations to dispatch or lowest cost dispatch, but that increase wasn't very large, which suggests that the obligation to dispatch is not rigorously enforced. But in the context of this discussion, we looked for new energy policies in ASEAN member states that would indicate an acceleration of the low carbon transition. And our work was at the last few months of last year. We did not see any. And although countries were saying we're going to build renewable energy, they were also planning to build fossil fuel capacity as well in the power sector. So we didn't come away thinking, oh, the pandemic really is accelerating governments' desire to push ahead with the energy transition. So I'll park that there, and maybe that evidence will emerge in this coming year. The second one is addressing the interests and concerns of the fossil fuel community. And now we had an excellent presentation by Casey Ho of Prudential Insurance in the previous session on an energy transition mechanism, which was designed to basically cover the stranded costs of coal-fired power plants. And that's fine. And you can do the same, I suppose, for coal mines, oil fields, and oil refineries. But of course, in all these countries, wherever you are, these are very powerful corporations, state-owned enterprises or private sector, and related political interests. But it's not just them, it's all the actors along the supply chains to these industries and services. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of people whose jobs will disappear. Now, again, in the previous panel, Michael Renner of IRENA showed how effective renewable energy is at creating employment, or could be. But as discussed in that panel, the employment needs new skills and may not be in the same locations. So, okay, maybe offshore oil industry can move to offshore wind. Maybe the oil industry can move to hydrogen, which nobody's talked about much yet. But I think the coal industry will be much more difficult because it's very much located in a small number of places. And there's certainly a risk in some countries that whole towns or even regions will just lose their industry. And certainly in China, where I work a lot, the issue of old mining cities is a real problem. And I think that, so I think the issue of redeployment of people is much more complicated than just saying, well, let's just sort of train them all up in renewable energy. It's a different location, it's different skills, it'll probably be the younger generation. And the stranded costs only hits the big corporations. It will not hit all the people who supply the widgets and gadgets that go into those plants. So I think there's a real social challenge here if you wish to accelerate. And of course, this is not new. I mean, in Britain, where I've come from, yeah, there are whole areas of northeast England that were coal mining and shipbuilding and steel that are now would be deserted if the car manufacturing hadn't come in. So this is not a new problem globally, but it's a new problem, I think, for Southeast Asia. Now, renewable energy. Now, the economists always tell us that the levelized cost of energy, of renewable energy, is usually, maybe in some places, less than that of fossil fuels, maybe. But for me, the transaction costs in many countries are substantial per unit of potential output of electricity, especially if you're talking about not just little bits of local electricity, you're talking about wanting to build tens of gigawatts of solar or wind across a country. Because I mean, the land area, if you're doing it on land, is several times that needed for, say, a nuclear plant or a coal-fired plant. And also, most renewable energy projects are not large enough to attract the attention of central government. I mean, if central government wants a gigawatt of nuclear or coal, it can make it happen. If you're talking about dozens of 50 megawatt plants, that isn't something that the central government can come down and just push and make it happen. So you're dealing with local governments, landowners, land use rights holders, villages. So the whole transaction costs of getting these plants in place, to me, in most cases, is going to be much higher. And it's not just a matter of the levelized cost of electricity. So I've taken a deliberately broad view here. The issue of, and coming back to Anbu Moji's talk, is the pandemic an accelerator of the low carbon energy transition, or is it going to be back as business as usual? The interests of the fossil fuel communities are much wider than just those of the core companies. It's thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who then are part of the supply chain into it, and then the transaction costs of renewable energy. So these are not solutions, I'm afraid, Dr. Jai. These are complicating factors in the push for the low carbon transition in Southeast Asia. I will stop there. Thank you.
I would like to thank Dr. Philip for giving us a fair assessment of the situation from his perspective. I cannot see even myself, so this system is okay. Anyway, okay. Where is my? Anyway, I start talking again. So with Dr. Philip, I would like to ask a further question on the next round, if we still have time. The role of natural gas, whether you see a gas as form of transition fuel, a fair way of moving toward the low carbon system for next round. Thank you. So next speaker, Dr. Connor Hickey, Research Associate and Lead Stranded Asset, or interesting, and Transition Finance. Very interesting concept. Oxford, the Sustainable Finance Program, please.
Great, thank you. Okay. Wonderful to be here. So I'm going to speak on a few points at the moment. What we've seen internationally, and what's great to see about the energy policy of ADB is the focus on clean energy growth. But as we know, and as important as it is to grow clean energy, it comes as a risk potentially, and it has in the past, to incumbent utilities as well. And in that process, they've lost a lot of money. And as a result of that, and speaking and drawing on from Philip's earlier points, Dr. Phillips's earlier points as well, that's come at a cost to particular communities where coal plants have been shut down as well, and has kind of gone against development objectives even in developed economies where areas have fallen back into poverty or have created large social issues. So today, I think one of the things I'd like to advocate for in the energy policy of the ADB is a recognition of the stranded asset risk that currently lies within Southeast Asia. I'm going to try and quantify that a small bit, and also the way that ADB may be able to work together with member state countries to reduce that risk for incumbent utilities, for example, as they're going to be incredibly important to deliver infrastructure at scale that's required to meet these challenges. So, great. So I'm going to give a brief overview as to what stranded assets are and the environmental related risk. A very simple approach to measure stranded assets in Southeast Asia, some analysis of that, and then what the implications could be for ADB's policy. So stranded assets are assets that have suffered from unanticipated write-downs or unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluations or conversions to liabilities. And there's a lot of context that this can form through. I'm going to speak briefly today on the transition side, so clean energy costs and the policy implications, but there's obviously physical risks that can cause it. Legal liability and litigation can cause those issues as well. Among social norms, we're seeing pressure for companies all around the world to reposition their service offering around clean products and products that don't harm the environment, for example, in any way. And this can have impacts for supply chains across the world as corporations work to reorganize their operations around clean energy. And also the economic perspective of stranded asset risk and the absence of policy is also understood. This is some brief analysis from Carbon Tracker, but effectively showing that we've passed a point where in large parts around the world, new renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. We're moving to a stage in some places of the world where new renewables are cheaper than operating the cost of existing fossil fuel plants. They do some initial analysis on new dispatchable renewables being cheaper than new fossils, but not really at a scale that's conducive to seasonal storage, more just batteries. But the idea is that existing infrastructure today, like coal plants and gas plants in Southeast Asia, could become stranded, not because of policy, but just because of market dynamics, and they could be uncompetitive. And we've seen this happen at such an accelerated pace in Europe and the US already, and that it could likely be something that features strongly in the next 10 years in Southeast Asia. But one thing I want to get on top of as well is, well, how aligned are these countries with Paris, the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios, and what kind of risk does that lie? And how does that have implications for further renewable energy investment? Growth and the use of fossil fuels in power generation has been incredibly important for energy access requirements, and most likely will be in the future. But if it can't make money or sustain itself, it reduces the financial capacity for utilities and countries to invest in cleaner forms of growth as well. And if it's not managed properly, leads to industrial decline potentially and social issues. So in this analysis, I'm briefly just going to stack up all the power plants in the world. What are their projected future emissions over their expected lifetime, and how does that comply with carbon budgets? So these red lines in this graph here represent carbon budgets. The different colors represent the different fuel types, and they're all ranked by carbon intensity. So let's take the least carbon intensive source of energy around the world to the most carbon intensive source of power generation around the world, and see how compatible they are with each individual budget. So if we ran all these plants together, how many would fit in this budget based on a certain carbon intensity? This does not account for the important piece, which is an equitable and just transition for Southeast Asia. And there's definitely refinement in analysis to do that, and it should be considered in any sort of analysis of this area as well. But just to briefly go through it from this analysis, well, according to a 1.5 degree budget from the latest IPCC budgets, about 43% of global power generation assets in fossil fuel power generation assets aren't compatible with the Paris 1.5 degree budget. And these are the earlier RA5 scenarios, and then those scenarios which are a little less flexible and have different assumptions, up to 93% of global fossil fuel units are not compatible with the 1.5 degree carbon budget. So what does this mean for Southeast Asia? Well, putting this analysis on top of Southeast Asian countries, it shows us that in this graph, what we're seeing is a view of what is the incompatibility of fossil fuel units by individual countries in Southeast Asia. And what we can see here is that up to between 40 and 50% are likely to be incompatible with the 2 degree carbon budget in Vietnam and Thailand. And Indonesia also presents as a significant risk as well, in the fact that up to between 20 and 30% of fossil fuel units in that power generation in Indonesia are not compatible with those budgets either. And if we take this analysis and just bring it across to maybe 3 major utilities that operate in those countries, what we find is with the 1.5 degree budget for Thailand's electric utility agency, the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand, EGAT, for 1.5 degree budget, up to 98% of their fossil fuel units may not be compatible with those budgets. Again, this doesn't account for equitability, and that's a huge concern in its own right. But if we, the most carbon intense assets are likely to be coal ones, and they feature further out on that carbon lock-in curve I presented earlier. And with major utility in Indonesia, it's in the high 80s, and also in Vietnam for the major utility there, again in the mid 90s as well. So a significant amount of misalignment potentially in those portfolios. If the economics of it doesn't work out, that's going to inhibit these utilities to make money into the future. There's significant state support or very tight market regulation. So that presents a risk to delivering on ADB's energy policy in some respects, to enable actors in these countries to deliver infrastructure. So what are the main implications of what I'm saying? ADB has done incredible work over the last number of years and is likely to continue to do that, of course, with committing to align its operation with the Paris Agreement, its investment in renewable energy. To reflect this, ADB is updating its policy to provide guidance and screening criteria on the use of fossil fuels to ensure no conflict with broader international goals to which ADB is and its member countries ascribe to. Coal and gas plants, as I've said, while they're a priority for delivering energy access, in the long run, the economics just don't largely make sense. And they really make, they're unlikely to make it's uncertain if they'll make the financial return required to pay for themselves, even in the next 10 years. And ADB's policy aims to avoid investing in potential stranded assets. So this analysis would show that while future investment in these regions would be misaligned and could potentially be a stranded asset already. And this has got implications for international trade and supply chains, as I mentioned earlier. For factories relying on power, they may need clean electricity to facilitate with what we're seeing is the rise of carbon border taxes abroad, and this creates huge problems in its own right, and firms looking into emissions accounting in their own operations as well, and how they can reduce their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And so we need to manage the wind down of fossil fuel infrastructure. That could be a pillar of ADB's policy to mitigate the impacts of stranded assets on these countries, and to secure their economic viability and growth in the future in the most just and equitable way possible, which is, of course, what they're doing. And that the first step, I think, to do that is to commit to a coal phase-out strategy, which could be useful to indicate to stakeholders that we see this as a significant risk, which I'm sure the bank already does, but you should too, because the region is heavily invested in coal and the bank's leadership could heavily influence that. That's my brief presentation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Connor, for your presentation. I could not see the slide, but I have colleagues taking note and will get your slide. I will reserve also a further round of questions to you specifically, since we are talking about this stranded assets. Would you be considering the level of carbon price in determining eventually in your assessment or sensitivity assessment whether one investment or one asset would become stranded asset, or you have other factors to be considered, like competitive technologies? What the specific factors would help us to determine what asset may become stranded? So that's a question. I'll come back to you. So before that, I would like to ask Ms. Randy Christiansen, economics and financial analyst from IEA International. IEA, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today. I will make my intervention quite short so we also can get to the discussion, but I think it's quite clear that in order to reach sustainability targets, investments must go up. And obviously ADB is a key enabler of this in Southeast Asia. I think one of the things that's been touched upon here in the other presentations is the age of thermal power plants and in general, the context of Southeast Asia. And to me, one of the key barriers, but also opportunities for Southeast Asia to transition to cleaner energy sources is actually the context. So to me, you can't really have a power sector without taking into account the existing assets. And a holistic approach to energy transition is really important. Holistic approaches also includes grids. Grids are a key enabler of flexibility in order to integrate renewable energy. Asia does have a large, diverse set of resources of renewable energy, and connecting areas, both within nations, but also between nations with grids is key. Understanding also how to mobilize finance with grids is really important, because currently grids are mostly financed by the nations themselves, but obviously with the pandemic, priorities have, competing priorities for the investments have increased. So one important point regarding grids as well is if you increase grids but don't increase renewable energy, you'll actually see an increase in emissions. So when you invest in grids, they need to be coupled with very clear deployment targets as well. And I think that is a very important point, that sometimes you see that grids don't qualify for green finance because of you can't guarantee what type of power they transport. But if you couple them with actually some target lending, where you have targets for deployment of renewables, you'll still see a positive green effect of investing in grids. I think that is very important. Another key consideration has been touched upon by various other speakers is utilization of existing assets. So existing assets may need retrofits. We see that across Southeast Asia, the minimum stable run rate of coal, for example, is quite high compared to international systems where you use these assets for flexibility. Another key point for that is actually also considering the commercial flexibility. That is actually a barrier for flexibility in many systems, both across Asia, but also other systems. So we see in Southeast Asia that there's a current lock-in effect because there's a lot of minimum take obligations in PPAs, physical PPAs currently, that actually don't allow for renewables to necessarily come in properly in the merit order, because if you have take or pay obligations both on fuel supply contracts but also on your generation assets, then effectively the fuel becomes sunk cost and it has the same marginal cost as renewables. And if you're used to operating a system with a lot of thermals, then it might just be easier to curtail the renewables than run the existing assets. So in that sense, there needs to be a clear analysis of the extent of the problem of physical PPAs and how potentially to restructure them or create different mechanisms for incentivizing flexible operations of the thermal assets. So in short, obviously there's a lot of different technologies within the renewables that can support Southeast Asia, but the holistic approach with looking at contractual flexibility, technical flexibility, and especially grids, I think is a key enabler to set Southeast Asia on a path for success for clean energy transitions. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Randy, for your remarks. I learned good messages from you, and you mentioned grid, and this is one of concerns for ADB. Half of our lending is in grid. But I will have a question to you later on. Hopefully, we still have time for a second round. Do you believe that the cross-regional interconnection between nations would also help the growing penetration of renewable energy, knowing that the energy system, many people are saying that the renewable energy would go for, the whole energy system will go for decentralized, distributed. So do you still believe the large-scale inter-nations connections, India is talking about global, and China also, they're talking about global interconnections. So what would your views from that perspective? So with that, I think we have went through a first round of interesting presentations. I would like now to go back to our first speaker, Dr. Uttama, who was, I hope he's been prepared for my question. Take one country, for example, how this particular country can move away from fossil fuels. What are the challenges? You know, since the whole ASEAN countries, most of them are very much coal-dependent. Please, Dr. Uttama, please.
Yes, thank you, Yong Zai. It is in the reality speaking, as you may know, that Indonesia has established a 10 gigawatt power plant in 2009, and then continue with their plan on the 35 gigawatt of power plant in the next decades after 2009 until today, and still going on. And most of those are coming from the coal power plant. So the meaning of this is that most of the coal power plant being built in the country is quite relatively new. That's why it is a very big challenge for the country to really suddenly switch from this coal into totally without coal power plant, or dismantling all of those to be the new fuel. It is very challenging indeed. But the good thing is that the country already considering on the next 35 gigawatt plant for using the HELE technology. As I mentioned previously, the high efficiency and low emission kind of technology on their new development. And they also already considering on stopping the all subcritical type of power plant, and try to increase the share of natural gas power plant, and also increasing the share of RE as well, on especially the VRE on the grid. Another challenge on that matters is in the system itself. The country need to upgrade and advancing the grid, and also installing the smart grid as well. And the thing is that the main grid in the country, Jawa, Madura, and Bali, currently is oversupply, especially after the COVID-19 happens. This will also creating another issues when we haven't connect the Jawa, Madura, Bali to Sumatra, and that's still becoming an issue. And in regard with this potential in Southeast Asia, whenever we already connected between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the peninsula, as well as the northern part of the region, this issue can be easily solved, because the demand is widely available into the other countries in the region. So if we talk about when, it is, we discussed the other day with area as well, and with the member states. It will not happen very soon. Even in the next 20 or 40 years, it may not be happening drastically. But bit by bit, we try to reduce our dependency because of these two main issues, affordability and security. Whatever it is, the region, especially in Indonesia, we need to import later on in the next 20 years, both coal and natural gas. It is also another reality. So whatever it is, we need to think on the transition seriously to mitigate the problem of the securities issues as well as affordability issues in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Utama, for sharing your assessment of one example in Indonesia, and we see clearer that the challenges here. Still in Indonesia, not Indonesia, but Ambu, I think you are based in Jakarta still. What's your advice on new reforms that would push low carbon transition by market forces?
Sure, and here to answer, that is what could be the new innovations, but we also need to look into back, that is how our first generation of reforms has worked out, and sometimes it has failed. And if you I'm coming to the renewable energy, that is also related to the low carbon. And here we find many countries are basically implemented the reforms to improve basically it is a kind of technology push approach, like feed-in tariff and feed-in premium, and also subsidizing this renewable energy. And this basically partly worked out. But at the same time, we also see some kind of conflict at the macro level, and between one is that is subsidizing these fossil fuels, and as well as the promoting the renewable energy. Basically, we find that conflict within the technology push approach also. Then what could be the future? And here the future emerging economies, like I think within the region, and only one country that has been introduced this carbon tax. I think that is also at a very low level, and still this carbon tax and the ETS, this emission trading systems at the sector level or at the country level or the city level, these are the kind of new opportunities available for to be tested and experimented. And as it is happening in China and Japan and Korea, and this has to be watched out. But these things, market mechanisms doesn't work perfectly, and we need a kind of enabling conditions where we need to look into that is how these subsidy regimes exist. For example, taking the case of Sumatra and Western Malaysia, it could be grid connected, but why this is not happening? Why market is not working? Because of existing the different subsidy regimes. So this is a kind of prerequisite for introducing these market reforms. And basically there are two more areas, there is a policy areas where the countries or the ADB new policy could look into it. Another is how this trade regimes and energy regimes and the climate regimes can come together. Now they are operating in different silo patients. And for example, ASEAN Economic Community exists, but still this is the tariff barriers remain high in the renewable energy and the energy efficiency technologies. So that is the one area that is ADB can look into it in the future. And second thing is how to converge this fiscal policy regimes and the energy policy regimes. For example, when we introduce the carbon pricing mechanisms, how this revenue recycling can happen. How this extra revenue that is developed through the pricing mechanism can be invested on the renewable energy or the energy efficiency improvement. And here we don't have a kind of clear case studies or the existing models, but it has to be experimented and innovated. And but we do have some of these working models exist in the other part of the regions where we can look into it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ambu. I have a follow-up question, but prepare yourself if we still have time. And you talk about carbon pricing, and this is true. I think it's an effective way of renting our investment, favoring low carbon solutions. But how do you see affordability issue? As Dr. Utama has earlier mentioned, that the concerns for many developing countries, one is affordability, the other one is supply security. Making carbon price that's effective, but whether that would make the price of energy services more expensive? How do we deal with that? I consider that also part of so-called just transition. Often people talk about just transition for different workers in the sector that may lose their job. But I think just transition may also require making sure that whatever we provide to people, to poor people, you mentioned that it should be human-based, the solutions. So the affordability is an issue I want to also hear from you as an economist. Next, I would like to go to Dr. Philip for my earlier question, if I can find still my reference, but you would remember my question.
Yes, I can remember the question. The issue is gas as a transition fuel in Southeast Asia. I've been quickly looking through IEA and ASEAN Center for Energy projections, and yes, gas is there. It takes decades before it replaces coal, but because one of the challenges in Southeast Asia is energy demand, and particularly electrification and electricity demand is going to keep rising for a long time. Not just for industry, but for space cooling. Fortunately, you don't need space heating down here, which is obviously the problem in northern China and places. So you're going to need continued investment in new electricity capacity. So why not have gas? It's got less carbon dioxide emissions and other pollutants than coal. It's more flexible. It therefore supports renewable energy. But I think in most of Southeast Asia, it will come at a higher cost than coal. And coming back to Dr. Jai's comment of, yes, the users will have to pay more. Also, I think a lot of the incremental gas is likely to be imported as LNG, unless I used to be an exploration geologist a long time ago, but unless there are massive new discoveries made in the Southeast Asia region, it will be imported LNG. And yes, that's a market price. Sometimes it's very low, sometimes it's very high. So, ASEAN is exposed to increasing imports of oil already. By moving to gas, it will become import dependent on natural gas, which can be dealt with, but it's a risk. So yes, it's there. It's not the magic bullet, but along with renewables and energy efficiency, hydrogen, importing electricity by wire from Australia or whatever, gas is part of the mix. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Philip. Since I see you're based in Singapore, I would reserve a third question if we still have time. Now, how do you see Singapore? Singapore is using a lot of gas, but Singapore also declared very ambitious target for climate action. So how do you see how Singapore will move away from fossil fuels and get a lot of gas in there? So. Reserve that for next round. I hope we still have time. Next, Dr. Konoriki, I think I was asking about carbon price, how that would affect our assessment on this existing asset or future asset. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree to your earlier points too that the carbon prices should be integrated in a way that's really fair and just. And obviously, I'd support the maybe commitment of governments in the region to have a gradual increase from a low base in carbon price over time to give corporations the opportunity to shift their decision making towards investments away from coal into renewables, even though it is quite urgent, the implications for costs to consumers. And if there isn't sufficient alternatives like clean energy, it can just lead to issues of rising fuel prices rather than that shift. And also, those carbon prices are likely to siphon away cash flows that could be used to transform a business. So I think strong incentives to transform and that recognize potentially the weaker balance sheets of those utilities are also really, really important. But I think the state, the actors like ADB and utilities working cohesively together to resolve these problems is really effective in an area where increasing energy prices are a huge concern. But I think to these plants, the and utilities, the bigger risk is international trends and the pace at which countries are moving, and how that positions Southeast Asia's competitiveness as a fantastic place for manufacturing and other services to the global economy, and how that plays into global supply chains and the emissions accounting of corporations globally.
Thank you, Dr. Connor. I also have a follow-up question. Actually, given your position, your title there, I see stranded asset we talk about. Then you have in your title transition finance. I would like you to define what is transition finance in the next question, and whether this include the rehabilitation of some coal-based coal-fired power plant, or it's about natural gas. What is about compared to what we understand better, climate finance? What is transition finance? What's actually included in there? But the next round. Next, I think I asked Ms. Randy about interconnections.
Yes, thank you very much. The idea of very global interconnections is a great idea. I think, though, we need to respect when you're talking cross-border interconnection, that you're talking about interconnecting or tying together infrastructure, critical national infrastructure. And as such, it's not as easy as it may look. So before doing a large-scale global electricity network, I would say let's start a little bit smaller. And I think, for example, ACE is doing very important work in their AIMS-3 study, showing how Southeast Asia can interconnect. And you're also seeing some good initiatives coming out of Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. I will, though, say when you're talking about cross-border interconnection, I think it's really important not to repeat the same mistakes of the coal assets, that you make very, very fixed long-term PPAs on your grids. Because grids has been shown to be a very effective tool to increase your balancing area, smooth out a lot of the variations that you see from renewable energy, but you certainly cannot do that if you lock yourself into physical PPAs on the interconnection as well. So having market setups that allow flexible utilization of the grids is important. For example, you're seeing in Laos that they have a lot of hydropower. And if you compare it to, for example, Northern Europe, they can take on the role of for example, Norway, that they're doing for Scandinavia. Norway is allowing Scandinavia and Denmark, where I come from personally, to integrate high shares of wind. But that's only possible because Denmark can export power to Norway when the wind is high, and they can import hydro back when the wind is low. So in that sense, I think, especially with the diversity you see across Southeast Asia, that grids are an excellent opportunity. But again, I must stress, physical PPAs, fixed physical PPAs will hinder that. And secondly, if grids are built out, again, without deployment of renewables, you'll just see an increase in emissions, because you'll see that coal currently is the cheapest source of generation in Southeast Asia and will be favored compared to, for example, gas. So I think, again, the holistic approach to how you build out the grids is really important.
Thank you, Ms. Randy. I also reserve a third question to you. You mentioned the experience in Northern Europe and in Europe in general. The grids are better interconnected, for sure. But these grids happen because there is a consensus, commitment among countries. In our region, that pushing for regional interconnection is not just a question of economics. It's not the technologies, not only about renewable energy, also about political wills and commitment. Mm-hmm. There are more, I would say, some perception of energy security from the other point of view than, there are countries, trust has to be built. What are the good lessons we can learn from Europe, make a successful, interconnections, everything is good. Economics work, technology are there, but countries just don't like to get perhaps overly dependent on each other. And this happened in former Soviet Union states, that they were used to interconnected, then somehow they are now much more independent, and the grid is operating much smaller scale in terms of trade among them. So that's a question, perhaps a difficult question, but I really want to hear from Europe how that can be best dealt with. Now back to, I forgot to ask a question to Dr. Uttama, but I think about one. But let's go back to Dr. Ambu first. You remember my question?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Jai. And it is a very complex question, and how we can make carbon pricing affordable. And basically, the question is also related to willingness to pay. And if you see, that is many, and we are very fancy about carbon pricing, but in the hard reality is nobody is willing to pay. And why? This carbon tax or the carbon pricing is going to be a painful process. And there will be losers and there will be winners. And the basic question is how we are going to compensate for the losers. I think that is a kind of a narrative that is we need to think about it. At the national level, how we can move forward, and my formula here is just focus on the subsidies, and then move gradually to introduce these emission trading systems, and then finally go for the carbon tax or the carbon pricing. I think that kind of stepwise approach could be kind of pragmatic and given these hard realities that is we are facing. And the second thing is this carbon pricing could also be kind of need to be seen from a kind of regional effort. If you're coming to the Southeast Asia, most of them are the export-oriented economies, where the energy pricing or the carbon pricing is directly linked to the competitiveness of their industries. And here we need to think about it. And even in the COP21 in the Paris, basically they were proposed for the global carbon price, but it failed. And that may be the fate at the regional level also. Here we need to think that is how we can coordinate and harmonize this emerging market. And there are 3 countries in the region has already decided to introduce this emission trading system. One country has already introduced the carbon pricing. And here we need to discuss and decide and what could be the appropriate level that may be at the very low level. A second thing is to look into this other past experiences, for example, China and Japan and Korea and India, and how these things could be combined together and kind of club making, and these countries can come together and learn from each other and then start with this low-hanging fruit, which is that energy efficiency improvement. Then stepwise we can move towards this decarbonization of the electric system and finally that fuel switching. I think this is a kind of my thoughts for having a stepwise and gradual regionally coordinated way of introducing the carbon pricing.
Thank you, Dr. Ambu. I thought about a question to Dr. Uttama on another question. Actually, I assume there's still a great deal of subsidies to gasoline and some other petroleum product. What's the current situation in Indonesia or in ASEAN? And what are the moves that, instead of increasing the carbon price for, that's good for renewable energy, but you can also remove any subsidies for fossil fuels. That's another way to make things happen. So that's a question to Dr. Uttama, but also Dr. Ambu, you can help as well. I think you are also specialists in this. Okay, next my question to Dr. Philip was on Singapore's ambitious plan for carbon neutrality, whether there is a chance, how physically, technology-wise, how Singapore is going to achieve that objective, and as an example for other island nations.
Well, I'm not sure they've actually pledged that they will. It sort of will consider how to do it and when. I mean, the problem with Singapore is not just an island, but for anybody who's been here, it's an island covered in concrete and people. It's one of the most densely populated, small countries in the world. So you've got a real space problem. And so, yes, there's a solar PV roadmap published by the Singapore Renewable Energy Research Institute. Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore. And yes, there's a significant percentage that can be solar, especially if they can get solar on the reservoirs, solar on every building, solar on the facades of buildings. You know, you can go some distance, but you'll obviously need storage. But the problem is you can't have onshore wind, there's not enough space, and all the offshore is covered with ships and ports and whatever and sea lanes. So you cannot develop offshore wind, you can't develop marine energy except for solar energy in very small places. So there's a real problem there. What are the options that are being looked at? Clearly energy efficiency, hydrogen is another, importing renewable energy. So that's why back last October, the government announced, okay, we're going to start importing a tiny amount of energy from Malaysia, but that's a start to bring more energy, either hydro from Laos or new solar from Malaysia. And as I mentioned earlier, there's this idea of a line from Australia to bring renewable energy in. But no, they haven't worked out, and we're involved in helping them working out, I suppose, how to put all these things together. District cooling systems that are efficient, all of that sort of stuff. It's going to be a real challenge to put it all together, and control systems to make it work. Not in my lifetime, maybe in Connor's lifetime. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Philip. I also learned not to read about the Australian project. That's a huge, ambitious project. Let's see what's going to happen. My next question to Dr. Connor about the definition of transition finance.
Yes, great. So back to your point about the title. So stranded assets is a recognition of the problem, and transition finance is about, for some companies, they've got up to 20 years to deal with this, and that's true in Southeast Asia as well. And in a recent study we currently did for European utilities, we found that over the next 20 years they could completely decarbonize their portfolios with minimal impacts on their credit ratings. So to formally define what transition finance is, and the big reveal, the director of our institute has published a definition of it, which I'm going to use here. I've been called to quote. Transition finance is the provision and use of financial products and services to support counterparties such as companies, sovereigns, and individuals realize alignment with environmental and social sustainability. So what we're seeing internationally is the deployment of sustainability linked debt products, loans, and different use of proceeds products. And all of these can be used to incentivize companies through lower cost of capital, for example, if they meet certain sustainability alignments like emissions reductions. How can that be used to help these counterparties, such as coal utilities, and incentivize them to reduce to zero emissions or net zero emissions, depending on the sector they're in?
Okay. Maybe another question quickly. This one short. How long you have been, this whether you call it division or unit, of stranded assets and transition finance? Is it new or it's been there for some time?
It's been here since 2011. And it was largely the centre's sole focus, but in the last 2 to 3 years, it's been something that I've been delegated to deal with as well. And if anybody wants to learn about it, please get in touch or to get access to the slides I presented today. Happy to share any information.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A question to Ms. Randy about advice on how to build consensus on the interconnections.
Yeah, thank you very much. So IEA is actually doing quite a lot of work on multilateral power trade in Southeast Asia. We, in 2019, published a study called Establishing Multilateral Power Trade in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. And I think before I used Europe as an example of resource sharing, but I really want to stress that the European model might never be relevant for Southeast Asia. So in the study that we did, we bring a lot of different case studies around the world. And for example, when you look at Southern African power pool, they have a different approach to cross-border power trading, where they're trading gaps and excesses. And I think when you're talking about cross-border power trade, the really important point is to start building trust. So this can be done with less integrated model, like the type of model that you have in Southern Africa. Because obviously there is a political trade-off between being independent and economics and meeting your climate goals by actually integrating. And it's going to be a political decision. And I don't believe that the same political decision may be valid across the world. So Europe, for example, has the massive benefit that they have a supranational organized institution, the EU, that can actually enforce rules within the member countries. You don't have that in Southeast Asia, and you don't have that, for example, in Southern Asia, where you're looking to integrate, or Central Asia for that matter. And that type of sovereignty surrender you might never want, and that is perfectly okay. So that is to say that there are different models where you don't optimize across countries in the same way, that will still bring massive benefits in terms of resource sharing and integration of renewables. So I encourage anyone to get in touch or look at the study that we published, and happy to take up discussion on this.
Thank you, Ms. Randy, for your advice. Good study from IEA. We'll come to close 5 minutes more, but I still have one question to Dr. Uttama on fossil fuel subsidies. And after that, I want to each of panelists to answer me one question from me related to policy, energy policy for ADB. I remember this session is about ADB energy policy. The question is short, but I want to get your advice on that. Your answer can be brief as well. So the question is, would you recommend ADB to withdraw financing entirely for coal, including new coal, building new coal, and rehabilitation of existing coal? This will be a question I want to hear from panelists, from whether from your professional background or your country background, your understanding of the issue, whether this is recommendable to ADB, withdrawing entirely from coal finance. Now, first from Dr. Uttama from on fossil fuel subsidies.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Yongping. Fossil fuel subsidy is quite sensitive issues in the region, very political in that sense. Currently, in fact, some of the countries already lifting up the subsidies. But in regards with this issue of transition, I think that will be, in my opinion, personally, uncorrelated directly between the lifting of the subsidy and the increase of VRE or RE in the region. Whatever it is, in the end, the region require a quite strong requirements, which is the affordable system, the energy security, affordability, as well as sustainability. So, regardless the issues of the subsidies in the sectors. I think that's my response on your particular.
Thank you. Any additional point from Ambu?
Yeah, and this subsidies, I think almost all countries have the subsidies, and what is the extent of the subsidies, and what is the implications on the tax structure. For example, in Indonesia, and here the tax base is very limited, but the subsidies maybe at one point of time that is 13%. But this pandemic and these low oil prices provide an opportunity for innovate. And for example, the conditional cash transfer programs, that is targeted for the low-income households, and for the small and medium enterprises. I think it is a kind of win-win strategy, and we need to be more innovations how we can protect these losers. I think that some countries like Indonesia and also as well as India is very successful in introducing the subsidy reforms.
Okay, thank you very much. With the remaining 2 minutes, I will come back to my earlier question. I can reformulate that question in a different way. Whether the question could be whether there are exceptional cases that ADB could still finance coal. Back to our panelists. I hope it's not too difficult. Let's start with Ms. Randy on reverse order.
Yes, thank you very much. I think when you look at least the IEA World Energy Outlook scenarios, it's quite clear that the only coal that will come into the system in Southeast Asia is coal that is already planned. So I don't think withdrawing finance maybe from things that are already signed and sealed, just not delivered, is the best, because you also need to make sure that you have proper investment environments going forward. But I do think that new deals might not be the best, because as Connor would point to, stranded assets is a real risk, and you don't want to create more of those. I actually do think that retrofitting and programs for retrofitting, if they are retrofitted in a way that they allow for higher flexibility and the PPAs are restructured so they actually commercially can run flexibly, might make sense. Because again, I think it's a little bit utopian to think that you can just get rid of all the coal assets overnight in Southeast Asia. So you need to think of a way to actually utilize them as a bridge to where you want to get to.
Good. So let's hear from Dr. Connell then.
I largely agree. I think financing new coal assets probably wouldn't be a good idea. Just because of the economic case, but for existing infrastructure, the case for retrofitting is really, really good, because it can maintain employment in the region, provide better jobs, and it's a more equitable way of dealing with it. For new investments, they're probably going to need to be converted at some point in the future, so it makes sense just to do that now and get it out of the way, rather than running into the additional costs in the future and the wasted capital, organizational and financial issues that arise from committing to it. So yes to new, and to refinancing old coal plants, and that there has to be exceptions, because the economic impacts would be devastating for some regions, obviously.
Thank you, Dr. Connor. Now, Dr. Philip, please.
Well, I just really to add, yes, I mean, the money that you might have put into coal, put into gas and carbon capture. But again, the caveat is there that if you guys and others don't finance coal, the Chinese might. And we haven't yet seen the Chinese banks really make a clear statement that they're edging towards it, that they would remove themselves from coal. But that's the key to watch in Southeast Asia, I think.
Thank you. Dr. Ambu, please.
Yeah, it is I think complex question, and the one thing is the what heart speaks, and another is the hard realities. And my first question back goes to that is whether ADB has the resources to finance the coal, and here basically the private financing can help it, and basically continue this older policy and focus more on the renewables. And if you are interested in and basically putting on the carbon capturing or the new type of energy like a hydrogen fuel, maybe an area that is ADB can look into it. And basically the private sector financing can help under this new clean coal power plants. That is my stance.
And thank you, Dr. Ambu. And lastly, last word from Dr. Nuki Adya Uttama, Executive Director, ASEAN Center for Energy. You have the last word for the session.
Yes, thank you. I do agree to the most speakers on the not 100% lifting the potential of the financial support to the region towards the coal. As we're realizing that in our projection, as well as the most of the member countries agreed on the increasing share of the fossil fuel, particularly on relying on the coal, is quite heavy in the next 20 years. I think that will be very difficult condition if in the region having zero financial support coming from all of these development banks. And we're really looking for some development bank which is providing this financial support, as mentioned by Dr. Philip, maybe perhaps China, because of this terminology of sustainability in every countries, every region are different. And that's why also very tricky really on not having a support for these particular issues. I think focusing on Hele is one of the things that we need to really looking forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Tama. With that, we close the session. I just want to thank all our panelists for spending 1.5 hours for discussing, helping ADB to reshape our energy policy. And also I thank participants in the audience for being with us. Thank you so much.